I know this attention-grabbing title invokes a lot of feeling, so I'll hurry. One thing we can probably all agree on is that we should focus more on preventative measures against child endangerment. Would you then be surprised to hear a study by Max and Jarrett which found those who have an attraction to children interacting with them more socially and even physically, non-sexually of course, had less self-legitimizing thoughts of sexual contact with them. You might be skeptical at first, for good reason. So imagine a scenario, let's say a shut-in, attracted to someone their own age of course, who doesn't go out much. They have very little social interaction, but one day they have to go shopping for food. They get to the store and the clerk, of course doing their job, is very polite. This person then interprets their greeting as flirtatious. Something so common has become personalized to them. They interpret it with extra meaning. The same thing can be applied to those attracted to children. If they are not interacting with kids often, they are more likely to see childlike playfulness as flirtatious reciprocity. The next thing you might say is then, well, aren't they at fault for even assuming such a thing to begin with? Anybody who assumes a child is acting flirtatious is morally wrong.
But are we really in a position today to continue claiming adolescents aren't sexual? Now sure, you might argue that you're referring to children who haven't gone through puberty yet, and that's fair. Prepubescent children are very unlikely to be sexual. So you might be even more surprised by the results of another study I show you, which find that most children who are sexually assaulted don't get assaulted by those who are attracted to them. Rather, sexual sadists target children because of the power dynamic. They're easier targets for them. But still, seeing the statistic 26.8%, 1 in 4 is still very high. Even if minor attracted people are only a quarter, that's a quarter. You would be right to assume a minor attracted person is lying if they say they aren't an offender, right? But there's a problem with that logic. The sample size used here are those who have already offended. To get an accurate representation, we would have to compare it with the minor attracted people throughout the overall population. But therein lies another issue, because we don't know how many there are in the overall population. Estimates can vary from 1 to 5% for pedophilia, and remember, that's only one category. Age attractions vary as well. We don't know how many there are of any specific category, whether ebophilia, necrophilia, or pedophilia. Most of what we know comes from studies of clinical or criminal justice samples who are very likely to differentiate in meaningful ways. Greater histories of family abuse or neglect, juvenile delinquency, psychopathology from the population of individuals with atypical sexual preferences. Moreover, because of the legal focus, most of what we know is about pedophilia, and to a notably lesser extent, ebophilia. Last, as already noted, most of the research has focused almost exclusively on men. We know very little about women, or about sexual age preferences in juveniles. Regardless, the statistics and data we have so far clearly show most minor attracted people are not offending, so the social stigma against them is extremely unfair. You probably think so naturally that pedophile and child rapist are synonymous. But have you ever stopped to think that there might be someone who is not controlled by their attractions? If not, is it really so dangerous a thought? What if I showed you a clip right now of a self-identified pedophile openly admitting to volunteering with children, having no issue with controlling their behavior, acting as anyone else would? Maybe not. You probably dismissed the idea the very moment I said that they claim to. Because after all, how can you trust a single word that they say? Is that really a valid argument, though? This video is about that more than anything else. Why is it that you have such certainty in these thoughts that they feel so natural to believe in? Before I get into the main video, I still do want to end this introduction off, not with another study, but the words of someone who openly identifies as a pedophile. If you don't believe their words to be genuine, that's fine. They're still important to listen to.
What sort of contact have you had with a child?
The contact I've had with children is social contact, not sexual contact. In the past, I did do some volunteering with children.
You done volunteering to work with children?
Yeah.
Knowing you're attracted to them?
Knowing that I had the attraction, but also knowing even at that stage that I wasn't going to.
Well, purposely knowing you're going to be working with the kids?
What do you mean by purposely?
You wanted to be around kids. Is that so you can perv on them?
No.
So when you was there, you didn't fancy any of them?
Yes, I did, but it's not the same thing.
But how is it not the same thing?
Stop me if I sound crazy, but have you noticed just how much people hate pedophiles? No, seriously. The amount of attention directed at those attracted to children is staggering. Entire industries are profiting off of the emotional reaction people have of a number of hypotheticals. The most pervasive of which, I'm sure you've heard of, these predator hunting groups. I'm sure you get a kick out of whenever some niche internet micro-celebrity gets outed online publicly for everyone to see. But they point to a much larger issue, one that they themselves perpetuate. There's something not quite consistent between the messaging and behavior of these supposed pedophile hunting groups. These people would use the term pedophile and predator interchangeably. They claim that they're making our community safer with their tactics.
We've experienced this in our lives before.
Joe Jones says, founder of a pedophile hunting group known as Guardians of the North.
Physical abuse, mental abuse growing up. It's a huge motivation because the fact that people are getting away with things like this, with the age of the internet, it's a lot easier.
When hearing words such as these, you'd assume the person speaking them has a lot of empathy for someone who, according to them, has a lot of issues. Those issues being, of course, an attraction to children. Yet, this interview comes from a documentary where a man is hospitalized because of how Joe confronts them.
I'm making a citizen's arrest. You will be going nowhere until a police officer arrives.
Doesn't really sound like an empathetic citizen trying to help. Rather, it sounds like someone trying to get off using their authority, using an excuse, someone being attracted to children who's an easy target, to get away with having such authority. Well, the next thing you might say is then, who cares what their motivations are? They're still making our community safer, aren't they? And as a matter of fact, if there's anyone who deserves to be treated this way, it's pedophiles. Firstly, these people aren't just harming those who do have an attraction to children, because of course, as with any disorganized group, they get unrelated individuals caught in the crossfire. Back in 2020, members of a group called the Child Online Safety Team harassed a man on Facebook Live for 14 minutes. And when I say that, I don't mean that they were just on the call. They berated and restrained him on the pavement while streaming their actions for 14 minutes. This was a man they had falsely accused, but that doesn't mean it would have been any better had he had actually been guilty. Who were they actually helping by having him restrained on the pavement like this? He wasn't actively assaulting anyone, so they weren't protecting anybody. They were just getting off on harming him. A significant number of you might say that, well, if he was guilty, it would have sent a message to other would-be sex offenders out there. But I ask them, a message of what? Don't sex offend? I hate to break it to you, but anybody who's going to has already heard the message. If you recall, I opened up this video referring to a study which found that social and physical contact with children helps dispel beliefs within minor attracted people that children are relating to them. But that means that there are a significant amount who do believe that they are genuinely reciprocating feelings and are rarely intending harm. To go even further, humoring the position that there are people who do intend harm, I have already pointed out as well that they are most likely sexual sadists, rather than a minor attracted person. I could go even further, referring to a comprehensive systematic review of 24 different studies on crime deterrence.
Advocates of focused deterrence strategies argue that targeted offenders should be treated with respect and dignity, reflecting procedural justice principles. The Chicago Project Safe Neighborhood Strategy, for instance, was aimed at increasing the likelihood that the offenders would buy in and comply voluntarily with pro-social, anti-violence norms being advocated by interacting with offenders in ways that enhance procedural justice in their communication sessions.
I didn't have to read a systematic review, but I wanted to. Because I could have just said violence isn't the answer and not checked if there was actual evidence to what I said. But there were people who were willing to hold a man down on the pavement because they believed that he was so morally reprehensible. I don't know what sort of evidence they had, but it wasn't the evidence that led them to act such a way. Hi, this is me in the middle of editing my footage, and I wanted to make a quick note here. The comprehensive review I cited is updated every 5 years, which means that actually most likely before this video is finished, it will be updated, but while I am recording this, it is the most latest edition from 2019 that I cite. But while I'm here, I also would might as well go into a few issues that some might try and point out. The studies in the review, none of them go into actually sexual crime specifically, but there are criminal gangs, which is the most positive targeted crime deterrent group. For the ones that it does apply to, then this comprehensive review would positively point to crime deterrence. And for the rest of them, this review also points out, when related to drug crimes, which it does cover, that one of the biggest issues is being unable to relate to the broader population, because drug users are such a broad population with minor attracted people. That seemingly would apply too, with the fact that there's so many that we just don't know about because they're obviously not coming out, that there would be an inability to relate to them. So by just confronting them outright, it would seem like that's not an appropriate response to try and deter them, or restraining a man on the ground, you know? Do you remember Chris Hansen and To Catch a Predator? Do you know why it ended back in 2007? Well, the reason is a man killed himself when they trespassed on his property and accused him of intending to solicit sex from a minor. Right now, you might be waiting for me to tell you if he actually was guilty or not, to influence your opinion on the situation, but that misses the point. Do you think everyone on that show is guilty? Most people do, and the people who get arrested on the show are very aware of that. Having that in mind, you might consider why someone who is innocent would want to avoid being put on the camera like that. They don't want their friends, their family, their coworkers, and the whole world to see them and assume they are guilty. You would even consider why someone would go so far as to kill themselves, while still making sure everyone around knew that they weren't going to be harmed. Those who were there that day recount that his final words were some variation of,
I am not going to hurt anybody. I'm not going to hurt nobody, guys.
He, like most others, knew that they would be tried in a court of public opinion before a court of law. He never got his presumption to innocence, so I don't feel like going into evidence. It shouldn't matter whether or not he was guilty, because if it did, we're drawing a line between who deserves to live and who deserves to die. If you really care, you can go look into it yourself. The point is, a man died as a result of actions that many people supported, not only at the time, but to this day. The second study I showed in this video revealed just how many actual pedophiles are convicted sexual offenders compared to the overall population of convicts. When you recognize just how much our society demonizes these groups for the actions of a small number of their population, you start to question the narrative built upon these false premises. Despite all the stigmatization, many still brave the anxiety, seeking out help and support. Surveys conducted by organizations such as Before You Act have found that the number of outlets are far fewer than would be adequate. Now knowing that most attracted to children aren't actually preying on minors, but are just people dealing with the intense judgment society places onto them, do you feel concerned? Judging a whole population for the actions of a minority of them, I thought there used to be a word for that, but I guess we all conveniently forgot. I might just be some radically progressive non-gender conformist, but I remember it being called discrimination.
If you're still watching this, I assume you've opened up to some extent on the way we view minor attracted people as a society. If not, then I guess you're watching this to make an accurate response. And I can respect that. I'd much prefer someone respond to all my points than just hating on me. One thing you might have been thinking while watching this video regardless is that, well, even if we have to treat minor attracted people better, there's still a disease. It's an illness to be attracted to children, and unnatural. Doesn't that require some level of social intervention still? Any treatment towards them should be, well, treatment. I said it myself earlier, didn't I? Many minor attracted people are out there seeking support that's unfortunately all too lacking in supply. If we're saying that minor attracted people are unnatural because being attracted to children is a disorder, then I would point out that DSM-5, the principal authority for psychiatric diagnoses, specifically states that being attracted to children is not a disorder without other factors involved. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of the DSM-5 with me, but the next best thing, toilet paper notes. If individuals also complain that their sexual attractions or preferences for children are causing psychosocial difficulties, they may be diagnosed with pedophilic disorder. However, if they report an absence of feelings of guilt, shame, or anxiety, and are not functionally limited by their paraphilic impulses, and their self-reported and legally recorded histories indicate that they have never acted on their impulses, then these individuals have a pedophilic sexual interest, but not pedophilic disorder. This is not just some random arbitrary textbook with its own definition. As I said, it's the principal authority for psychiatric diagnoses in mainstream medicine. Of course, this is not to belay any controversy surrounding DSM-5, which I will happily get into later in this video. It shows that there is a massive misconception between the popular consensus and what the medical community actually believes. Pedophilic disorder is not even considered to be just an attraction to children, as many people think it is. It's just as interesting to note, however, what pedophilia disorder is considered, since, as I read earlier, if people feel shame, guilt, anxiety, or have just even acted upon their impulses, they are diagnosed with pedophilic disorder. Yet such attributions are not indicative of any other disorder. Why is the anxiety not what gets diagnosed? Why does it become something else entirely if that anxiety is tied to their attractions? Anxiety suddenly becomes pedophilic disorder, rather than just anxiety. This manner of thinking runs fundamentally in opposition to the idea of what a disorder actually is. A disorder is considered something which inhibits your own personal functions. The only other psychiatric diagnosis similar to this is antisocial personality disorder, also known as psychopathy, which has its own issues, which can be talked about in a whole separate video. The idea that pedophilia and psychopathy are diagnosed for things which do not intrinsically inhibit one's own functions shows how socially constructed these ideals truly are. The criterion for diagnosing pedophilic disorder are completely alien to any other sexuality. Are you waiting for me to say it? Pedophilia is a sexuality. And if we are to understand whether it is natural or not, it means we have to fundamentally understand where our understanding comes from.
Why don't I start off by referencing one of the books that began my indoctrination down the liberal arts pipeline? Fixing Sex, Intersex, Medical Authority and Lived Experience, a book by Caucases, talks about the bioethical dilemma of those who fall out of the Western gender binary. She starts off by discussing a convention taking place in Chicago all the way back in 2005. Of course, terms such as intersex have been very contentious, so I hesitate to use it so blatantly. This is exactly what the convention was about. International experts from all over the world gathered to revise definitions and guidelines in the hopes of reducing stigma.
The term intersex will be replaced by the more general descriptor disorders of sex development, referring to congenital conditions in which chromosomal, gonadal, or anatomical sex development is atypical. Other terms such as hermaphrodism, sex reversal, and gender-based diagnostic labels were to be replaced by a system based on clinically descriptive terms.
Did you see a problem there? Of course, they realized how antiquated and offensive the old terms were, but they failed to realize why. Do you really think that if you were diagnosed with disorders of sex development, you would feel better than if you were diagnosed intersex? What would you feel if you were diagnosed with either of those? Would you feel nothing at all? Would you feel good about yourself? Or would you feel that there's something wrong with you? But what exactly is wrong? This is where we get into the problem of intrinsically imbuing things with functions, viewing the world from a standpoint of systems. Because, yes, there are systems in the world, but they are not naturally in place. What we view as a system of functions and purposes are completely projected onto them by us. We view the human body as having a purpose. The purpose in Western society for women is to give birth, have children, raise a family. So when you break it down, the main purpose of a vagina is vaginal sex, as Caucases notes later on.
From the standpoint of treatment, the new guidelines fail to resolve an issue that lies at the center of current controversies: early genital surgery. The guidelines acknowledge that there are minimal systematic outcome data about genital surgery, that orgasmic capability may be harmed or even destroyed by such surgery, and that there is little documentation to support the widely held belief that early surgery relieves parental distress about atypical genitals. The statement nevertheless says that surgery can be considered for young girls with severe genital virilization, which will include procedures to reduce a too large clitoris or to create, open, or elongate a vagina on babies and toddlers.
Not to just continue paraphrasing the much better and in-depth work by Caucases, but what makes a clitoris too large? As you can see, when viewing from the perspective of having a purpose, the main purpose overshadows everything else. Sure, the clitoris can have its own function as well, but it is secondary to the main function of the woman giving birth. Vaginal intercourse trumps anything else. As such, if one has a clitoris which gets in the way of that, it doesn't matter whether or not the clitoris is fine perfectly natural, it must be done away with. To fix them, reduced, trimmed, completely mutilated, to make sure the woman is proper, to make sure they're correct in society. There is no intrinsic function to anything in the world. The functions are what we ascribe to them. Therefore, if giving birth is truly the function of humanity, or at least how the West views humanity, you can see how we got to the point where pedophilia, an attraction to those who cannot give birth or have children in any way because they are prepubescent, became viewed so unnaturally. But that is all socially based. In reality, what exactly makes them apart from anybody else? Again, as I've stated, and I hate to have to reinforce this idea if it's not already clear, most minor attracted people are everyday people.
I took on a regular babysitting gig. She was 5. She was a precocious girl. She was advanced for her age. She was also very independent. A lot of my fantasies actually revolve around little girls who are in some way more powerful than I am. Eventually, my attraction became, overwhelming to the point I had to go relieve myself in the bathroom. That's when I had to leave town and get my head straightened out. I didn't abuse her because I knew the harm that it could cause. Also, remembering the fact that I was abused, it probably contributed to my own sexuality developing. I have never sexually abused a child, and I never will. I've gotten to know a lot of pedophiles online. My sense is that we're a much larger group than society actually thinks we are. The terms pedophile and child molester are used interchangeably. This is wrong. A pedophile is, strictly speaking, somebody who has a sexual attraction to children. It's important to realize that not all pedophiles are child molesters and not all child molesters are pedophiles. When I first told all of my family, they had a hard time dealing with it. They had a hard time reconciling what they knew about me versus what they thought they knew about pedophiles. I went through a severe bout of depression and social anxiety that lasted a few years. A lot of that was basically me coming to realize that I wasn't going to have a family. I wasn't going to fall in love with a woman and have a normal life. I'm resigned to the fact that, I'm basically going to spend the rest of my life alone. This is not something I chose. What person in their right mind would choose to be the most reviled sexuality in the world? My purpose is basically to go out and educate people, allowing people like myself to express themselves, to come out and be open. Society makes it harder by persecuting us because a lot of us become fatalistic. We just start to think it doesn't matter what we do or say, they're going to hate us anyway. We need to find some kind of middle ground where society and pedophiles can come together. We love kids, we want to protect them too, and we're on society's side on that.
They're not going out of their way to offend in any shape or form. So what makes them disordered? It is our social conception. What we need to recognize is that our institutions reinforce a standard set by the culture they originated from, and a hierarchical social structure which represents the upper and ruling classes. In Western society, it just so happened to be predominantly European-descendant heteronormative men. Due to some processes which have been occurring over the past few hundred years, European influence has drastically altered the world, and therefore a heavy Eurocentric perspective has taken hold. With heteronormative men at the focal point for so long, their image has been what's represented in culture. They are the standard, and therefore everyone else is remarked by their differences from them, rather than just their individual features. Gay men are marked by their gayness, yet straight men are just considered men.
I think when I was younger, I really was tempted to play into the gay best friend stereotype. I think it was a really easy way to maybe integrate myself into social groups in a way that wasn't, aggressive or threatening. And sort of coming from an all-boys school, seeking friendships with girls was really, really important to me, just because it felt like a safer space. But then the sort of other side of that was there would be times maybe when I was treated like a piece of furniture. Sort of girls would take their tops off and get changed in front of me and say, oh, well, it's fine, you're gay, you don't mind. But they never asked me, and actually it made me feel really uncomfortable that there would be these people just taking their clothes off in front of me.
I see what you mean, though. It's a bit dehumanising, isn't it, when people do that?
Yeah, you become an accessory, just like the latest handbag or something.
In a racial context, this can be seen with The Simpsons. Matt Groening has given multiple explanations as to why the characters are yellow, but the point is not everyone is. Despite the fact that this is a fictional world where the normal skin tone is the color yellow, we have characters like Apu, who is Indian, and Carl, who is black. Did they really have to be a different skin tone to have these cultural features reflected? Not to put this on Matt Groening himself specifically, but if the point overall is to make sure that there were representations of these cultures, wouldn't it be more inclusive and diminishing the idea of difference by showing that anybody, regardless of their skin tone, could have these cultural reflections within their life? Why, to truly show them in the show, did they have to be specifically shown differently? When we recognize that our conception of what's normal comes from a socially generated set of expectations reflected from a upper and ruling class, we can break free of these arbitrary restrictions we fear violating. To now quote a book I chose to read for myself long after successfully being indoctrinated by the cult of cultural Marxists, Henrietta Moore's A Passion for Difference states,
intersubjectivity and dialogue involve situations where bodies marked through by the social, that is, by difference, are presented as parts of identities. The uses of the body, the particular circumstances of interaction, and the readings made by others are all involved in the taking up of a position or positions that form the basis for the enunciation of experience. Experience is thus intersubjective and embodied. It is not individual and fixed, but irredeemably social and processual.
we identify ourselves by how we differ from those around us. When paired with a society that has a hierarchical structure, those who identify parts of themselves which don't align with those at the top of the social ladder will be seen as lesser by those around them and themselves.
We can draw a direct comparison with pedophilia. On its own, even the psychological literature agrees it's not a disorder. Yet we have such a moral objection that we add extra weight to the category just so that it can meet our expectations. It's not just stress, anxiety, or depression. If it can be tied to your sexuality, then your sexuality is directly the cause for all your discomfort. I hope you didn't forget, because we are going to get into it now. You do remember when homosexuality was considered a disorder, don't you? I mentioned a DSM-5 earlier, which, if you didn't know, is the 5th edition. Back in 1952, when the DSM came out, homosexuality was listed as one of the disorders. It was not until the DSM-2 in 1974 when social activism had propelled awareness to the point where homosexuality on its own could no longer be considered a disorder, of course. Instead, in the DSM-2, ego-dystonic homosexuality was the replacement, and its diagnostic criteria might sound familiar to you, as it referred to those who suffered emotional distress as a result of their homosexual desires. And gee, imagine what people today would think of that. Putting the burden of someone's emotional distress onto a characteristic someone cannot choose for themselves? I'm so glad we've moved past that and realized that social conventions are to blame for stigmatization. As a matter of fact, it was not until 10 years later, 1984, that sexual emotional distress was removed from the DSM. What was sexual emotional distress? Well, it was emotional distress which came from someone's unwanted sexual orientation. And if that doesn't point to the lack of self-awareness during this time period, I don't know what else will. Why would someone's sexual orientation be unwanted, I wonder? Surely, we must recognize that social conventions play a pivotal role in creating what we consider normal. For the sake of argument, let's consider minor attractiveness a disorder, because, let's say, the emotional distress is somehow an inhibitor of your own functions in some way. In that case, would we not still put the burden on society for creating this emotional distress in the first place? Not to sound like a preachy liberal, but if someone was starving, would you not give them food? I'm not saying to give all minor attracted people someone to fuck. I'm saying that we have millions of people currently starving for someone to just come out to, because they don't want to have to keep a personal part of themselves hidden away their entire lives. It's the same reason anybody wants to come out, because who wants to hide a part of themselves? And whether you like it or not, they are part of our community. We cannot continue to otherize them. The only reason we don't know who they are is because they don't know how they can trust you with their personal information. They risk ridicule their entire lives, and that's getting off easy in this country. I want you to think about how you would respond if someone did come out to you as being minor attracted. Even today, the trans community has continued to face exclusionary policies segregating them from research of their own people under the pretense of excluding bias.
There's a lot of things to criticize about the Cass review, but there's one thing that seems to be particularly exemplary. Trans people were deliberately excluded from joining key oversight teams for fear of introducing bias.
Well, that's perfectly reasonable because, as you know, cisgender people are notoriously unbiased when it comes to trans healthcare. Now, I understand the logic here. I really do. I totally disagree with it, but I understand that trans people are likely to have a personal investment when researching this issue, and for some reason caring about things is icky. But to not include a single trans person, or a trans healthcare expert at least, on these key oversight teams, to not include those who can provide informed pushback or provide a critical lens, is not to exclude bias, but to trade one bias for another.
Dr. Hilary Cass was chosen to lead the evidence review because of her lack of expertise in trans healthcare. In what other branch of medicine do we intentionally exclude key stakeholders and experts from medical policy research? This is the fundamental problem. It's not that she's some secret far-right figure or a transphobic plant. In fact, in the past few days, she's clarified that she supports youth access to puberty blockers and hormones. Yet, right-wing publications and figures are upholding the Cass Review as the end of gender-affirming care as we know it. Dr. Cass was not equipped to handle this subject, good intentions or not. The review was doomed to fail.
As trans people, we rarely get the chance to contribute to popular public narratives about our own lives.
One thing you might naturally think when watching this is, what about cisgendered people? Aren't they considered in the equation as well? And that's when you realize they don't think cisgendered people could have a bias. Cisgendered people aren't a people at all. It's trans people who are a community. They are one cohesive people, so of course they'd have a bias. But cisgendered people, they're the norm. Everyone who isn't trans is cisgendered. So cisgendered people don't have a community to have a bias towards. It's an argument whose logic is inherently flawed because you can never disagree with it. The person arguing considers it to be common sense. You're the one who has to provide evidence to disagree with their viewpoint. They don't have to provide any evidence for you. Their viewpoint is the standard. You're the one who has to disprove them. If there's one thing to consider when analyzing these social biases, is how few marginalized communities were actually a part of these diagnostic criteria deciding committees. There were little to no intersex people deciding what constitutes gender, and there were likewise few gay people, if any at all, deciding the diagnostic criteria for being diagnosed with homosexuality. Researchers who've examined these marginalized communities have done so from a socially accepted position in society. Researchers, among themselves, see what they have in common. They therefore look at who they're researching and identify how they differ from one another. This then goes on to reinforce whatever preconceived notions they had in their head about these people. These differences, to them, are actually the reason that they've been marginalized. It excuses any unequal systems because it presupposes that the differences they've now seen are the reasons for the other differences in status. Bodily differences, sexual differences, cultural differences. All these now make sense because obviously those are what are keeping these people down, not the systems we've put in place. The fact that anthropology as a field has for so long examined other cultures as one cohesive hive mind is the reason Henrietta Moore wrote her book, A Passion for Difference, which I cited earlier. What this means then is, from the researcher's perspective, they are who they say they are, occupying a singular subject position for the most part. They are heteronormative, they are male, and they are from an upper or middle ruling class. What this means then is that for everyone else, such as gay, trans, black, women, and of course not individually, since many may occupy more than one. The point is, as the norm, the expected character, very rarely do they have to jump subject positions. They are who they say they are, staying in their singular identity, whereas others will have to jump in, changing their expressions of self to match socially generated expectations. Yet they will always be in the center, never having to move all that much. That is not to say that white men were not having to adjust their identities in the 60s. It's to say that the upper class had very little need to, and had less of a struggle than that of everyone else. You could see then how researchers at the time, and even to this day, saw the world in such a rigid state. They, from their upper class positions, had no need to constantly fluctuate like those who they studied did. Most people, in fact, constantly having to reorganize their expressions to fit in a certain social expectation to make sure they're not inaccurately thought of because of some unconscious bias for one part of their identity. Researchers had no need to think of the world in such a chaotic state, which for most people would be a more accurate description of things, of life. These people saw the world as a single state. They saw what they were and how others differed from them, and assigned normality based on a certain set of features. To this day, we have much better representation, yet, as the topic of this video might imply, it still leaves out many identities and communities, which causes immense harm based on what single aspect of them is reflected. As I've made very clear, when the only part of pedophilia which is represented is offending based on attraction, do you think of pedophiles in any other way? Before watching this video, did you? Could you have thought of them in any other way? Why was it so hard for you to think of them in any other way starting this video? Because it's all you've ever known of them. But even those who do not offend are not only defined by their attraction. The whole point I've been making is that everyone shifts their expression of their identity. Throughout life, you go about changing how you behave and act around certain people because different people have different expectations of who you are. And you want to reflect accurately what you feel would be best representative of yourself in those situations. To once again quote Henrietta Moore's book.
First, there is the understandable reluctance, equally evident in the writings of many feminist theorists, to relinquish the idea that persons in other cultures are rational, unified individuals in favor of a view of the subject and of subjectivity, which stresses its shifting, imaginary and conflicting nature. This latter view, while absolutely harmless for the average white male academic, could so easily become a pathological characterization of others.
When researchers were deciding what constitute a person, as opposed to a person with certain features attached to them, they were clearly blinded by their own social biases. Earlier, I mentioned how often sexual minorities, such as gays, are marked by their sexual identity in in the media. And I even used an example of ethnic minorities with The Simpsons. What you probably thought then, and I briefly touched over, was how it might have been inclusive. It was there to reinforce that they exist to people who wouldn't have even thought of it at the time. But it really served its purpose. Think about it. In the media, or even in daily life, are there not characteristics which you associate and use to identify whether or not someone is, let's say, gay? Oh. No, I'm not, but for a second, did you think I was? Maybe you knew I was trying to get you to think that way because of the nature of this video so far, but barring that, if you saw anyone else with my physique wearing something similar to what I am now, would you think that they're flamboyant, or would you think that they're being very open about their sexuality? But what about this is tied to sex characteristics? Really, what has gotten this idea that some manner of dress is indicative to who I like to sleep with? But why is it that someone wouldn't just be thought of being comfortable wearing this regardless? The media reinforces this concept. Going back to The Simpsons, let's reference Apu. Because he wasn't just drawn as anyone else was, he was specifically made a different skin tone. So then, when you hear someone with his accent, someone who talks the same way, someone who works in a similar convenience store type location, it gets reinforced that it would be an Indian, wouldn't it? But if Apu was drawn yellow-skinned like everyone else in The Simpsons, would it not be more of a concept of anybody? Not only anybody could sound like this, anybody could talk this way, anybody could work in any kind of convenience store location, with every character being a different personality, yet appearing with similar characteristics, would it not be a much more universalized message of community? Nowadays, those who see themselves in the same subject position as those represented in the media, there is a contradiction which arises internally when they see their own thoughts and behaviors not lining up with the only way they've known themselves to act. If they only see the media representing one side of themselves, let's say an Asian American, seeing how the model minority concept had grown throughout the 1900s, but who themselves does not feel so inclined to work and motivate themselves to reach the top of everything.
In 1966, the New York Times published a piece by Professor William Peterson titled "Success Story, Japanese American Style." This article is considered one of the most influential stories ever written on Asian Americans and effectively gave birth to the term model minority. It said, barely more than 20 years after the end of the wartime camps, this is a minority that has risen above even prejudice criticism. By any criterion of good citizenship, the Japanese Americans are better than any other group in our society, including native-born whites. At first, the term only applied to Japanese Americans. Then it quickly grew to include all East Asians. Then eventually, anyone who even looks slightly Asian.
What is said of Chinese is extended to Japanese, what's said of Japanese is transferred to Koreans, and so on and so on and so on. That's why the model minority myth has just expanded, because people really can't tell the difference.
In 1965, the Immigration Act reversed years of restrictive immigration policies that virtually banned all immigration from Asia, but it allowed only those with certain backgrounds to enter the US, namely professionals like doctors and engineers. It was a brain drain. And right as the civil rights movement was gaining steam, the model minority stereotype started to gain traction.
From the very beginning, the model minority myth has been false flattery. It's not even really about people of Asian descent. It's a way to insult African Americans, Hispanics, and others.
Asians have a long and storied history of civil disobedience in this country, which is often overlooked by the media. The media also plays a role in perpetuating stereotypes about Asians.
You see how easy it is to conceive internally that they are a failure, that they are falling behind on their peers because as a model minority, an Asian in America, they are supposed to excel. So if they don't, even if they're just average, they are lesser. Going back to being gay or even being trans, is it not clear now how seeing one representation is not enough, because nobody is ever just one side of themselves? And once again, I tie it back to pedophilia. Could I ask you if you could name one single media representation that is not negative?
What did you do, Kenny? They say it's kids. You've been looking at kids. And Lindsay's already there's some video of you doing like all of her friends have got it. Kids, Kenny. Tell me they're not.
Bag of cocaine one time. But a child, the most precious child, you can sell a 5-year-old kid 5 to 10 times a day for 10 years straight. And everyday ordinary people don't want to hear it. It's too ugly for polite conversation. But meanwhile, over 2 million children a year are being sucked into the deepest recesses of hell. Trust me, man. If we do nothing, their pain is gonna spread and spread. Till someday it's gonna reach the likes of you. And that will be a nightmare you're never gonna wake up from. Sorry.
Gaat zoeken.
Again, outside of manga, anime, and any media from East Asia, is there any representation of any age-attracted people towards minors which is positive in any way, even neutral? When you realize how much social work is actually done to reinforce our conception of who these people are, can you really say so assuredly right now that we need to do something about them? Really, should it not be, we need to change this for them? Could you imagine how they feel? Well, you don't have to actually imagine, of course, because former Professor Alan Walker interviewed 42 different minor attracted people for A Long Dark Shadow, minor attracted people and their search for dignity.
An assistant professor at Old Dominion University in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. And specifically, we're talking about Alan's book, A Long Dark Shadow, Minor Attracted Persons and Their Pursuit of Dignity. So the book is a study of non-offending minor attracted persons, a group that hasn't been discussed a lot either in the academy or in popular culture. So it's a difficult and important subject, and we're thrilled to have Alan with us today to talk about it. Thank you for being here. So my first question was, even the title of your book is pretty controversial, right? Because the subtitle is Minor Attracted Persons and Their Pursuit of Dignity. And many people are concerned that the designation of minor attracted persons, or MAPS, suggests that it's okay to be attracted to children, or they're worried that the term suggests that pedophilia is a sexual orientation, which they worry is a slander on LGBT people. So could you talk about why you used that term in the title and throughout the book?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that question. I use the term minor attracted person, or MAP, in the title and throughout the book for multiple reasons. First of all, because I think it's important to use terminology for groups that members of that group want others to use for them. And MAP advocacy groups like Before You Act have advocated for use of the term MAP. They've advocated for it primarily because it's less stigmatizing than other terms like pedophile. A lot of people, when they hear the term pedophile, they automatically assume that it means a sex offender. And that isn't true, and it leads to a lot of misconceptions about attractions toward minors. I've definitely heard the idea that you brought up, though, that the use of the term minor attracted person suggests that it's okay to be attracted to children. But using a term that communicates who someone is attracted to doesn't indicate anything about the morality of that attraction. From my perspective, there is no morality or immorality attached to attraction to anyone because no one can control who they're attracted to at all. In other words, it's not who we're attracted to that's either okay or not okay. It's our behaviors in responding to that attraction that are either okay or not okay.
I don't even have to get into the book's actual contents because the reaction to it speaks for itself.
Well, you will quickly see that this child protection organization concerns itself with such causes as kink awareness and sex workers' rights and decriminalizing sexting for children. That's one of the things they want to do. Prostasia insists that there is a sex-positive approach to childhood sexting. The organization is also right now planning, and this is quoting now from the website, planning, quote, research into the use of fictional or fantasy sexual outlets like sex dolls, cartoons, and fictional stories among people who have sexual attractions to children. Now, as you may be clued into by now, this is not a child protection organization, quite the opposite. But if you need to be further convinced, here's an introductory video from their website. Watch this.
Prostasia Foundation is a new child protection organization dedicated to promoting laws and policies that are both effective and constitutional.
We're a child protection organisation and a human rights organisation. We're actually the first to bring mental health professionals, human rights activists, sex experts, and internet platforms together.
Prostasia takes an evidence-based approach based on preventing abuse before it happens.
I think we're living in a time when people are frequently willing to think that making policy based on belief is a good idea. I'm not sure that's correct.
We don't shy away from controversy. For example, the idea that maybe we can change the behavior of people with a sexual interest in children, or the fact that the best placed people to keep minors out of sex work or the consensual kink community are sex workers and kinksters.
And so my thing when I encounter minors in kink is, first of all, that's great that you're interested. Please come back when you're 18. Here are some books to read.
We believe that it's possible to protect children while upholding our society's most important values, such as tolerance, diversity, and freedom. We are Prostasia Foundation.
Yes, our society's most important value, tolerance, they say. Now, notice how she says that we have to protect kids, but we need to also make sure that we're staying true to society's most important values. Now, I would say that society's greatest priority is protecting kids. But that for them is an afterthought in comparison to tolerance. And what should we be tolerant of? Well, Prostasia makes it abundantly clear through its website and videos that we should be tolerant of. We should destigmatize what it refers to as minor attracted persons, otherwise known as pedophiles. And there are others outside the organization joining in this fight for pedophilia acceptance, including, of course, college professors. Prostasia's YouTube channel, they haven't been banned from YouTube, of course. I mean, they're still on YouTube. They had an interview with a non-binary professor from Old Dominion University by the name of Alan Walker. Alan Walker has just written a book available on Amazon, hasn't been banned on Amazon, of course, arguing for tolerance of MAPS, minor attracted persons. You know, maybe once the FBI is done investigating soccer moms at school board meetings, they might want to have a look at Alan Walker and the Prostasia Foundation, if it isn't too much trouble, that is. Now, this is all quite horrifying and nauseating and infuriating, but we could learn something important by listening to the blood-curdling freak in that video. Now, Professor Them says that we should call pedophiles minor attracted persons because it's polite. You know, it's what the members of that group have requested that we do. We should allow groups to define themselves, and we should use whatever language they assign to us. The last thing we'd ever want to do, Professor Them says, is rather stigmatize them. Now you see here how the most hideous kinds of evil can be dragged up from the bowels of hell and sanitized and normalized, all in the name of politeness and being respectful to communities. That's step one, by the way. Once they start putting the label community on a group of people, that's step one towards normalization. So now we're talking about the pedophilia community. Much like maybe we talk about the serial killer community or the rapist community.
Immediately, Matt Walsh, notable for being confused on what womanhood entails, defers the association between attracted to children with offending against a child. There's no actual response to any claims made by Alan Walker. He just repeats popular connotations without any actual evidence. Oh, and insulting them, too.
Blood-curdling freak in that video. Now, Professor Them will be told that Prostasia and Alan Walker and their allies are fringe. And if that were true, you know, if they were alone on the field fighting this battle to normalize pedophilia and sexualize kids, you might not worry about it so much. It would be enough to chalk them up to a small collection of disgusting, anomalous dirtbags. And if we lived in a sane society, they'd all be going to prison. And that would be it. But the problem is that they're not alone.
And there it is, the moral argument. Now it's no longer about political ramifications or socio-cultural systemic issues. It's about being right or wrong. If your moral character is negative, then why would we even listen to anything you have to say, political or not? It could taint our morality. Your moral character is everything. If that is nothing, then you are nothing. Nothing you say has any value because you have no value morally. Oh sure, it would be terrible if we started to normalize things like rape and excusing rapists for expressing themselves. So it is refreshing to see topics such as systemic sexual abuse being covered by Matt, specifically that of the Catholic Church. However, it's very unfortunate that just by looking at the description, you can see that he puts the blame on gay priests being integrated into the church rather than anything else. Even more interesting is that when you watch the video, he specifically differentiates between gay and pedophile by making sure you know it's not a pedophile issue, it's a gay issue.
On Friday, published Friday night, and I was making a point about the scandals in the Catholic Church, and as I want to try to elaborate on this argument, if you didn't read the piece or even if you did, the point that I was trying to make is that the sex abuse scandal in the church is not a pedophilia scandal. Okay, the problem isn't pedophilia, unlike what we're told and what you hear in the media about all the so-called pedophile priests and so on. The problem is not pedophilia. The problem is gay priests in the church. And the statistics bear this out. This is not me. This is not a theory that I'm positing. This is just a fact. It's really indisputable. This is what statistics show. And most prominently, there was something called the John Jay Report that was, I think, the most extensive report published on the sex scandal in the church. And it shows that the vast majority of victims were male, and the vast majority were not prepubescent children. And pedophilia, by definition, is the sexual assault of a prepubescent child. So, by definition, most of this was not pedophilia.
Wow, did you catch that? Matt actually knew what a pedophile is clinically and educated you, the viewer, on what it is. So then it becomes clear that facts which are useful to him are clearly stated. yet those which aren't are just whatever. After all, you could see in the video much more recently of his when he used pedophile in the colloquial sense, the way most people use the word, to mean anyone attracted to minors.
What it refers to as minor attracted persons, otherwise known as pedophiles.
Even though, as we know, there are different categories: hemophilia, necrophilia, or pedophilia. Yet, despite knowing the difference between them, having a video 5 years ago showing such, Matt doesn't care to differentiate in his much more popular videos because he knows it doesn't matter. It's pretty ironic what's happening here, since Matt knows very well not to take numbers at face value since they can be interpreted in a number of ways, yet what he does is ignore all other implications of what might be causing these rates of sexual abuse, having such a narrow perspective on sexuality. He uses the John Jay report, the very famous and well-cited report on abuse in the Catholic Church, so of course I had to read it as well. Before I rebuttal any of Matt's claims, though, I have to get into some of the other reactions to Alan Walker's book because it ties in very well and it's very important to get the full picture before I respond.
Could it be that we have finally reached the tipping point with wretched wokeness? This outrageous story you're about to hear certainly makes a powerful case that we are. An assistant professor at Old Dominion University in Virginia attempting to normalize, yes, normalize pedophilia, advocating we destigmatize and rebrand these deeply sick members of society. How could a sex offender not be a pedophile? I just don't get that.
Oh, really? You don't understand what you're talking about? You're on the news and you don't get what you're saying? Your meteorologist has a meteorology degree. Oh, wait. I guess they didn't when this aired either. Guess 2016 was a sign. It's hard not to get angry at clips like these because with Matt, you can leave the video angry at what he's saying, sure, but he has a point and an argument that you can get angry at specifically. With Rivera, he's live on air. He's the news. There's not any actual argument. He can't cut around the vitriolic apathy he exudes to get to some point. He's just talking. He's a guy on air. The point is that he has some charisma for viewers because that's what this really is all about, generating that story. The truth is, there is no intrinsic hate in anybody for these people. Despite what you internet warriors would like to believe, many actual friends and family did not change their opinions on their loved ones after they came out to them privately, because why would they? It changed nothing about them. You can see this in how of a non-issue it is to Rivera when talking to his friends.
The university, thank God, though, coming to its senses after that nonsense, placing that professor on leave, and the president of Old Dominion issuing this statement. I want to state in the strongest terms possible that child sex abuse is morally wrong and has no place in our society. Phew, Katie. Close call, it sounds like. Old Dominion.
Yeah, exactly. You have a little more. Do you want to?
Oh, I have more? Oh, sorry. I just wanted,
I appreciate you wanted to have a conversation.
Okay. The professor later saying, I want to be clear, child sexual abuse is an inexcusable crime.
Okay, now we're ready.
Now we're ready.
And we're back. And we're back. I was thinking that.
I'm actually flashing back to grade school in the city here, and I think there were drag queens entertaining the children.
I want to support full academic scholarship. You should be able to pursue as far as you want any taboo or controversial issue. But this is not a legitimate academic pursuit. This is trying to have a PhD help with the branding for the pedophile community. That's what this is about, and it's taxpayer money. This is funded by the taxpayers at Old Dominion Public School. This kind of is like the illegal immigration thing. Oh, you can't call them illegal immigrants because illegal is stigmatizing them, and we don't want to do that, so we're just going to call them wanderers or something like that. You have stigmas for a reason, Geraldo, okay? Pedophilia has a bad stigma because it's one of the nastiest things you can do. Now, here's what she says. She says that just because you are attracted to a minor doesn't mean those people act on that attraction. Okay. Show me someone who's attracted to a child.
She, that person was
Show me someone that's attracted to a young child as an adult that hasn't tried to touch that person, who hasn't surveilled a playground, who hasn't put themselves in an environment where other children are around, or maybe even watched it on the internet. No, that attraction is the strongest attraction in the human body. It's hormonal, it's inside your body, it's chemical inside your body. Nothing you can do about that. You have to keep those people away from children and stop trying to soft pedal it like it's just some attraction no one pursues.
I see his point her point, sorry.
Is it?
I don't know.
They, them.
It's a they, them?
Their point.
Did I misgender her or him?
I think so.
You can be fired for that.
I apologize.
Go to HR right now.
With the point being.
Why are you so emotionally engaged?
Because this is such a great story. And also because Jesse took my talking point, which is stigmatization exists for a reason. But you know what's weird? In a back end way, you almost agreed with the professor by saying it's biological. And if it is biological, it is not free will. So that means the pedophile has no choice in what their thoughts are.
But that does not stop you from stopping them from having access to children.
That's true.
Whatever their motivation is, whether it's sincere or not, I don't give a damn.
I don't think they're born pedophiles. I think something happens to them, usually in their childhood. Usually they're molested as children.
Oh, come on.
And then
it could be.
Usually that's what happens, and then they do that to other children.
Would you cut the coupon out in the comic to get my talking points on psychiatry?
His fellow co-hosts are just laughing about this because, again, it's not about any passionate feelings they have, it's about getting that sweet content revenue. The topic of pedophilia is such a social taboo that when the news talks about it, it generates so much more revenue because of the emotional response that comes along with it. In the beginning of this video, I referenced these predator hunting groups. You can see then why I felt it was so important to start off this video with a moral argument, because although yes, the very beginning came off with a study, and I continue to cite studies in the beginning of my video, I also integrated morality into it when referencing how they hurt people individually. I did this not because I feel the moral argument does have some part to play. I did it because I knew how inherently moral you would perceive it. I had to use morality to convince you in the first place to keep watching. But now that we're at this point and you see just how damaging a moral perspective is, can you see now just why someone would act based on moral reprehensibility as opposed to evidence? But there were people who were willing to hold a man down on the pavement because they believed that he was so morally reprehensible. I don't know what sort of evidence they had, but it wasn't the evidence that led them to act such a way. The news, much like the medical industry, represents a capitalist class first and everybody else second. The rich continue to grow richer while people grow more hateful. Our basis for understanding is entirely based on social constructs. Like I said, there's no natural system in the world. Everything is constructed in how we understand it. Yes, we have veins and arteries, but without our understanding of how it connects to different parts, it wouldn't mean anything to us. We imbued it with a meaning based on how we understood it to work. It's not that pedophiles are so uncommon because they're a malfunction. It's because we can never truly know how many there are if we continue to act as though they are. Because why would they come out of hiding? Have you seen the chart of how many left-handed people there were in society from the 1900s onwards, since people stopped considering left-handedness to be satanic? Similarly, in recent years, how there's been an explosion in those who identify as LGBT because, guess what? They can. They're not gonna be judged by it anymore, or as much. Our idea of the ideal persona for so long was the European heteronormative man. And although that's changed in recent years to include a multicultural and sexual background, We clearly have not reached equality, both in representation and just status. So then, another issue arises because if everything we know is based around social constructs, how do we know anything at all? How exactly do we make progress? What even is real life, man? If the medical community is prone to such social biases, what's the point? How do I even trust what they say? God. But it is a good question to ask, though, isn't it? How can I trust the knowledge coming out of these institutions we're forced to rely on? How can I be citing studies from a medical industry that has so much bias? And why am I so vehemently against Matt when he also is arguing against mainstream and establishment narratives? Well, it isn't that we don't have an objective reality. After all, we can chart out the universe mathematically. And I seem pretty real, don't you? What is subjective is not the world. It's our interpretations of the world. And of course, that might seem obvious to you, but I mentioned earlier how exclusionary research was back in the day. How they specifically let out gays from researching their own people, and how even today it's continuing into the trans community, and as you might expect, there are so few minor attracted people that we know of researching other minor attracted people. You've probably heard criticisms of postmodernist thought from thinkers such as Jordan Peterson, notable for falling for Chinese fetish porn Twitter bait. But those like Henrietta Moore aren't in favor of postmodernism either. They recognize the flaws from such thinking and have worked to improve and build upon it. Postmodernism specifically arose in prominence after the World Wars, finding an issue with modern thought at the time. It came to essentially see the world as completely unsolvable, everyone having their own subjective reality, and therefore no objective reality. Although it originated with genuine aspirations to figure out what went wrong with all these other ideologies at the time, it became a political cop-out, an easy way to argue why we don't have any progress, and a way to refuse arguing with others because you can simply say that it's impossible to debate. After all, we all have our own subjective realities, don't we? It's impossible to come to an agreement on anything. So then, with the past few decades, influential thinkers such as Henrietta have realized why it's so problematic to just assume we're just on a rock in space, man, nothing matters. Noting the failure of past schools of thought, in successfully analyzing how some people disagree with the social subject positions they're given, why some people within cultures disagree with the dominant subject position rather than just between cultures.
The power to define reality is an economic and political power. The experience for individuals of such external definitions has consequences, not only for their self-images, but for the material circumstances they find themselves in.
We are able to decide for ourselves which subject position we wish to reside in, which dominant social discourses we wish to uphold, and we make these decisions based on the material circumstances we find ourselves in, which subject positions would benefit us economically, politically, or any other way. As the clever feminist she is, Henrietta named this ideology, which came after postmodernism, something extremely unique.
The post-structuralist subject, on the other hand, is the site of differences which constitute the subject and are internal to it. This notion of an internally differentiated subject constituted in and through discourse is analytically powerful. It is of particular value in analyzing the question of how individuals become engendered and acquire a gender identity in the context of several coexistent discourses on gender, which may contradict and conflict with each other.
With this new perspective, we can view the concept of an individual as how someone differentiates themselves from others. Cultures around the world aren't homogeneous. There are subcultures, internal conflicts, and cross-cultural integration. In many ways, the postmodernist movement was very individualistic. Any sort of discourse as completely independent of one another. Everybody having their own view of the world. And that is where we find the biggest flaw of this. With everyone having their own sense of morality, of course, everyone's going to view the world a slightly bit differently. To argue that there are certain subjective realities that affect everyone independently is disingenuous to the objective factors which affect them dialectically, because everyone is experiencing these things in different ways because they are having different material circumstances influence them. Not everyone is experiencing the exact same financial hardship. Of course, that is a material condition which fluctuates depending on person to person, affecting them differently, not because they are somehow in a different world mentally, but because everyone's situation specifically is different materially. It's not the other way around. Again, financial hardship might only play one part. Someone might have familial hardship, romantic hardship, and all these might be in combination in different ways. This dialectical thinking is exactly what is left out in recent postmodernist thinking, despite all humanitarian aspirations in the beginning of postmodernist thought. I could name a few postmodernist thinkers who I vibe with, Michel Foucault, honestly, that bald-headed face, and speaking of Foucault, because of the topic of this video, French Enlightenment thinkers signed a petition around the 1970s that was against certain laws discriminating against sexual minorities such as gay people and even pedophiles. Of course, nowadays many people tend to ignore that part while promoting the rest of their theory, but why? Why is this petition something that gets erased? Is it not an important part of what they fought for? One of the more ironic parts of the recent postmodernist thinking is that they established this idea that everyone has their own reality as a universal truth, which means that is an objective truth of the world. And yet, if you try and point that out, well, I don't want to put it on anyone specifically, as each postmodernist thinker, they would agree, would have their own interpretation and rebuttal, but you see the point. That is why these ideas stemming from a moral point of view are so harmful, because you need to have an actual political consideration and a democratic consensus to come to when deciding such epistemic postulates. Rules that are going to be applied to everyone must take into account everyone's perspective. As we have figured out through post-structuralist thinking, people are constantly bouncing across subject positions. Certain people share certain subject positions with others, even if they differ on many others. This means there are shared experiences in some way. Of course, in terms of class, those in the ruling class have less in common with anyone of the working class, despite any subject position. There are still certain similarities across the spectrum. That is why it is so important to include these voices when having research done about these people. Why trans voices are important when discussing the trans community and analyzing research about the trans community. And why, when deciding pedophilia as a disorder, it is so important to remember there were likely little to no minor attracted people in deciding this, and absolutely none openly minor attracted who decided this. I can have faith in the studies and reviews I cited because they embodied the exact principles to look out for in research. They looked at previous studies, compared the results of those together and against their own, as well as looking at which biases might have influenced the researchers and themselves what external factors might have played a role in the results, and the researchers themselves represented a diverse part of the population. For some of the studies I cited, that does include minor attracted people, though I won't say for which ones for the safety of themselves. In fact, when I reached out to some of the researchers, they called me brave, and that's something which shouldn't be necessary to make a video like this. Finally, getting back to Matt Walsh, the key difference between us is our rhetoric. He'd argue that social acceptance is the problem. After all, integration of gay men into the church correlates with abuse against boys going up. I'd argue that social acceptance is the answer. Remember, this was during the 60s and 70s when gay men were integrated into the church. That means that the church was one of the few places where it was a haven for them. Social acceptance overall was still drastically low. Of course, this doesn't excuse actions, it explains them. If you look at the John Jay report that, again, Matt cited specifically, and look on pages 58 and 59, you can see that as social acceptance across society became more tolerable, and even reaching the point of modern day with acceptance in many places, abuse equalized across gender. These charts show the difference in gender for those abused in the church across years. We can look at numbers, obviously, they vary too much. Calculating for a percentage, and you get the change across years as follows. 1950s to 1960s male abuse cases rose 235.246%. For girls, it was only 88.5305%. From the 1960s to 1970s, boys' abuse cases increased 56.6626%. For girls, it actually decreased 19.0114%. From the 1970s to the 1980s, male abuse cases also began to drop, with this decade shift having a decrease of 36.7538%. Homosexual acceptance made clear strides during this era, and wouldn't you know it, the percentage of cases against girls decreasing was just about the same as the percentage of cases decreasing against boys, with negative 38.7324%. This might just be a coincidence, of course, so let's look at the shift from the 1980s to the 1990s. For male abuse cases, the drop was 75.2005%, and for girls, it was 44.4444%. Not only did the rates even out eventually, but the cases against males exponentially decreased to the point where the actual numbers are closer together. So really, Matt, it wasn't the gay priests which were newly integrated, it was the social exclusion of gay men everywhere else outside of the church. And another thing, even if these people were pedophilic, which they weren't, they were epiphilic, an attraction to pubescent children, don't we see at this point how it was driven exponentially due to the exclusionary social beliefs at the time? It only reinforces the idea that we must stop the prejudice against them if we are actually to curb child endangerment. Imagine being from this time period and not only being homosexual, but also attracted to children. There was never a solution provided to these people, and the most vulnerable were never given a chance to seek help before they reached a point where they harmed others.
And then on top of that, of course, every single perpetrator was male, obviously. So what does that tell us? That tells us that what happened in the church, and it may still be happening to some extent, is an epidemic of gay men assaulting mostly teenage boys. Now, it is true that that very same study that I mentioned, the John Jay report, there are people who are looking to absolve the gay priests, and so they will point to that very same study, because that study did also try to claim that homosexuality had nothing to do with the assaults, although it said statistically that in the majority of cases these were men assaulting teenage boys or post-pubescent boys. They said in the report, well, but it had nothing to do with homosexuality, it had nothing to do with orientation. But this is an assumption. I think a ridiculous assumption that is not borne out by the statistics. What the researchers tried to say is that, well, yes, this was all male on male stuff, but it wasn't because of orientation. But how could that possibly be the case?
I wanted to contrast those like Matt with those like Gerardo, because it shows just how different parts of our social fabric work in tandem to uphold these biases. They may have opposing positions and reasons for doing what it is they do, but either way, it doesn't matter because they are still propagating harmful systemic abuse, and many people are being harmed every day of their lives because of it. Those like Geraldo are easier to generalize since, as part of the news, they all share similar characteristics in that they are simply repeating what it is they're told to. So I'll continue with others who blend morality with politics like Matt, since of course he's not the only one, and they differ in many more ways.
It's called rape. It is rape, and it's happening, and it's a shame, and it's horrible.
It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street.
And suddenly it's so much more clear to you now, isn't it? Like Biden said, they're about to knock your mother on the head, shoot your sister, and beat up your wife. You need to do the right thing and help stop the bad guy. Like Trump said, it's called rape. It is rape, and it's happening, and it's horrible. So these people who are saying all the things that need to be said, I'm sure most of you would disagree with at least one of them, so what gives? Isn't it what needs to be said? Or are you realizing just how problematic it is letting morality blend into politics? Neither of them really care, and this is where it gets really interesting because they are more like the news, yet they blend morality and politics for an actual gain of themselves, personally. They're not just upholding some institution for institutional gain within some news corp. They're personally getting rewarded for this rhetoric that they continue to perpetuate. Morality has historically been used to justify political reaction. Desegregation was opposed on the basis that black men were more sexually active. It would be harmful for white women. They'd be endangered. Abortion legalization was opposed on the basis that it was morally reprehensible because fetuses were alive. Morality currently is being used to justify anti-immigration rhetoric. That clip I showed you of Trump, it came from an interview just recently where he was espousing how immigrants are coming to rape our women.
When you have illegal immigrants coming in, if they commit crime, they're not supposed to be here.
In that article, it says it's corrupt officials, it's traffickers, it's gangs,
sure, whatever
and
it is.
other migrants
Whatever
inside
it is.
Mexico.
But as I said before, it's called rape.
The main crux of the clip was about whether or not he actually said 80% of them are doing this, but even as he pushed back on whether or not he said it, it was not based on distancing himself from harmful rhetoric. It was because he didn't know if it was true or not, so he didn't want to be affiliated with a false claim, believe it or not.
You did indicate that the people coming across the border were raping 80% of the women.
I didn't, excuse me, you are putting things, read the article.
He never actually cared enough to separate himself from the claim because he wanted to distance himself from harmful rhetoric. And similarly, Biden, who recently distanced himself from the crime bill he helped pass in the 90s during his presidential campaign, even acknowledging his privilege as an upper-class white man, except that's not exactly what happened. He acknowledged his white privilege, specifically.
Do you see ways that you've benefited from white privilege?
Sure, I've benefited just because I don't have to go through what my black brothers and sisters have had to go through, number one. But number two, grow up here in Scranton. We're used to guys who look down their nose at us. We're looked at people who look at us and think that we're suckers. Look at us and they think that we're not equivalent to them. If you didn't have a college degree, you must be stupid. If, in fact, you didn't get to go to an Ivy school. Well, I tell you what bothered me, to tell you the truth. Maybe it's my Scranton roots, I don't know. But when you guys started talking on television about Biden, if he wins, will be the first person without an Ivy League degree to be elected president, I'm thinking, who the hell makes you think I have to have an Ivy League degree to be president? I really mean it. I found my backup. No, I'm not joking. I'm not joking. Like, guys like me were the first in my family to go to college. Up here, my dad busted his neck. My dad came up here, worked here, lost his job like a lot of people did here. There used to be a bad joke in the 60s in Scranton. No one's in Scranton, everybody's from Scranton because so many people lost their jobs. We are as good as anybody else. And guys like Trump, who inherited everything and squandered what they inherited, are the people that I've always had a problem with, not the people who are busting their neck.
One single subject position that he resided in because that would benefit him. He mentioned very little of class, and just a little bit before his campaign, a few years in fact, he was still defending his crime bill, saying that he had no regrets, arguing in fact that it even helped people.
Another thing about how perspectives change over time. Bobby Rush, member of Congress, said the other day, I'm ashamed that I voted for the '94 crime bill. You ashamed of that bill?
Not at all. And in fact, I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
And by the way, we talk about this mostly in terms of Black Lives Matter. Black lives really do matter. But the problem is institutional racism in America. I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
That's the overarching problem that still exists. And we should be talking about it. And you look at it, the legacy of racism in housing and jobs and so on. I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
So, but having said that, if you take a look at the crime bill, of the money in the crime bill, the vast majority went to reducing sentences, diverting people from going to jail for drug offenses into what I came up with, the drug courts, providing for boot camps instead of sending people to prison so you didn't relearn whatever the bad thing that got you there in the first place. Put 100,000 cops in the street. The woman, the African-American woman living in a corner alone where the drug deal's going down in front of her house knows she literally used to have your phone number as a cop. She'd call you and say, John, they're out in front of my house, but you're not giving me away, right, John? No. And it didn't. So we had enormous success. Now what's happened is we've cut the funding 85%. We've gone out there and we're going through Baltimore now. Look at the areas we're going through here. I'll lay you 8-5. The Baltimore Police Department is considerably smaller than it was in 1985. There are things I would change. I opposed, for example, the carjacking provision that the administration wanted in. But by and large, what it really did, it restored American cities.
This is ironic. This was, again, after the Black Lives Matter movement had begun, but before he ran for president. So, you tell me, what changed?
We moved to eliminate the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
So a black guy getting a nickel bag and snorting coke went mandatory to jail. Someone who did a line in Park Avenue got arrested. They got probation. I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
And so we've tried to change. There have been mistakes made. We've made significant mistakes, and we'll make more.
Morality, as seen, has no justifiable place in politics. You see here exactly how it's a reflection of popular consensus rather than a sign of any personal feelings, even if they might come up any now and then. It doesn't matter what Biden personally felt, whether he actually thought he was doing good or not at the time or even now, because what actually matters is how impactful it was to communities, and it was. They were completely upended by his policies. I know that the post-structuralist school of thought is flawed in many ways, as well as the postmodernist thought that came before it. I feel that its greatest contribution to philosophy is how it views discourses, intersectionality between race, gender, sexuality, and all others, and in particular, how it integrates class into all other discourses, because class is a very interesting social strata. It is contributing to exactly what other social positions have value. Based on who is in the upper class, they decide exactly how and why we view certain attributes and subject positions people reside in with contempt or with praise. It is the upper classes who get to define what is the standard and what is considered normal. It is therefore a class which decides how certain subject positions intersect and why they intersect and how they intersect. This was noted centuries ago, far before even postmodernism, by a certain man you might have strong feelings towards one way or another. Ernest Mandel, I'll just quote the manifesto.
The proletarian is without property. His relation to his wife and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeois family relations. Modern industry labor, modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped him of every trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests.
Marx notes very clearly that it is the ruling class's morality which gets adopted by those subjugated under them. It requires becoming aware and socially conscious to break free of these social constructs.
Hitherto, every form of society has been based on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can, at least, continue its slavish existence. The serf in the period of serfdom raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois under the yoke of the feudal absolutism managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the process of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law.
It is completely ignorant to say that other discourses are irrelevant to class, because it is exactly those discourses which get used by the ruling class to divide and subjugate everyone else. The best example could be American slavery. We all know about how it was racially based because the United States at the time had a class system that divided classes by race. It was slaves who were black and considered slaves. It was white people who were white and considered above them. Of course, times have changed and the ruling class has integrated, and therefore we have a class system much more different now than back in the day. Yet it is still class, the key component which divides people by their discourses, deciding exactly how we see people as normal in a very different way than back in the day. A great example of this would be the word queer. Do you think it means to be gay or LGBT, or maybe just another variant of LGBT maybe? Believe it or not, queer just means to fall out of the norm of society.
My word, you do look queer. My word, you do look queer. Oh dear, you look dreadful. You've had a near shave. You look like a man with one foot in the grave. I said, Bosh, I'm better. It's true I've been ill. He said, I'm delighted you're better, but still, I wish you'd 1,000 for me in your will. My word, you do look queer.
Of course, as those who society perceived as strange became closer aligned with those who challenged the norms of society, such as sexual minorities, the term queer became synonymous with the labeling them.
Now listen, you queer. Stop calling me a crypto-Nazi.
Let's stop calling names
you in your goddamn face, and you'll stay plastered.
So now think about modern day and just how much pedophiles are used to justify political maneuvers. We can't abolish the death penalty. What about pedophiles? You can't abolish prisons. Where would we keep the pedophiles? Abolishing the police? Who's gonna save you from the lurking pedophiles?
Though in theory Coalinga exists to rehabilitate and release sex offenders, in the last 10 years, out of the hundreds of individuals detained, only 13 have ever been approved for release in this way.
So, Mr. Lamb, this is the BBC, and we thought we would check in with you.
Good. Thank you. I'm Louis. Louis from the BBC. Great. What are you working on here? I'm just putting finishing touches on a little craft Ferris wheel that I just concluded working with, and it's a company that puts out paper products, and I'm trying to put them together as best I can with the limited resources, but it's been a challenge, and it really works. When it's finished, it's a good sign that the thing's been done well. Yeah. Dr. DeRosio said you're waiting for housing in the outside world? Yes, I've been ordered out by a judge for more than a year now, and I think just the wait for housing can be so intense sometimes because they really have to search hard and long for a place that'd be suitable. And the problem is that people in the community have expressed they just don't want a sex offender living among them. Is that it? That's the issue? It seems to be the problem is getting one placed who wants them next door.
Has the Conditional Release Agency given you an estimate of how many properties that they've looked at or they've solicited for people to rent to you?
They have given me an idea of somewhere close to 1,100 places that have been looked into.
So we have our fingers crossed.
More than 1,000. So far, no landlord has stuck with it. There has been one decline from a judge where there was a family group home setting that was within the 2,000 feet, and it was found out late in the decision. The other one was that the landlord was threatened actually verbally and left rattlesnakes on his porch. So it was physical threat, and the person just didn't want to hang in with that.
Did he say 50 victims? Yeah, he estimates about 50 victims, male victims, child molestation. So we're talking about a deeply entrenched...
Nobody was convicted of.
No, he was not convicted of 50 victims, but he's come to admit and take accountability for 50 victims, and certainly was his sexual preference for a long time. We're talking about a well-ingrained pattern of fantasies and urges around the objects of boys. So he really has come a long way.
I'd made another appointment with Mr. Lamb. Our first conversation had made an impression on me, and I wanted to know more about how he felt he'd changed. I chose to have, personally, a castration. Very few people have gone that route, but this relieved a great deal of the invasiveness of my deviancy, and allowed me to think and get into my soul and my head as to what I really did and the hurt. We're not talking about chemical castration, it's a physical operation. It was physical. I started with a chemical to seek that kind of relief if there was possible. And when I started taking those shots, I said, you know, I need this. And I chose the physical to make it permanent. What would you say to people who saw you now and said, well, he's saying the right things now, how do we know that he's changed? Why should we be willing to take that risk of allowing him back into the community? Coming from the source, there may not be much credibility, but I can only say that in the last few years of the improved therapy and the responses from doctors and the work that I've done, the phrase that fits is actions speak louder than words. I can tell you anything, but if my actions show otherwise, then I'm not credible. So I have to act well, to be well, and then to be talked of in a better light. So it's going to have to be proof in the pudding.
It's all moral justification for keeping the status quo as it is. We may still not know much about the world as we'd like, but there is an objective, tangible reality. What isn't objective is decision-making, because we all have subjective biases. That's why our heterogeneous makeup is our greatest strength. We can collaborate with multiple perspectives, people with diverse backgrounds and cultural influences. By having a collaborative decision-making effort, a democratic process, we can make sure we are not excluding any people because of our own cultural biases, which we don't even recognize, because we'd assume it's just normal. By separating morality from politics, we can see a clearer path towards social progress and generate a whole lot more inclusivity with socialist equality.
Coalinga cost almost $400 million to build. To keep each patient costs a further $200,000 a year. So it's surprising that the vast majority of men boycott therapy, viewing it as window dressing for a place whose real intention is to keep them confined indefinitely. Most prefer to try their chances with legal appeals. In fact, many more individuals have gone out this way than through the phased therapy program. How would you feel about spending the rest of your life in this hospital?
Well, I don't like it, but I really have no choice. This is the most corrupt program, okay, that I've ever seen in my life, okay? The phase program is nothing more than a sham that's here to hold us indefinitely. This is nothing but warehouse. Now, look at the big money they get. They get $200,000 a year for keeping us in here, okay? Nobody wants us out there on the streets.
I had one last appointment with Mr. Lamb. I'd heard he had a new housing option in his sights. I realized I'd started to feel he might be a changed person. But since our last meeting, I'd also had an opportunity to see his file for the first time, and I'd been shocked by the details of the abuse. I'd begun to worry I hadn't questioned him closely enough to be sure he was being honest with me.
Good to hear news like that.
Mim, you're Mr. Lamb's clinician, his chief clinician, or
His primary base provider, yeah.
That's what it's called. Are you familiar with the details of the offences that he committed?
Yes.
For me here, I have to level about with it. For me here as a journalist, the one challenge that I'm sort of presented with Mr. Lamb is that because he seems so upset about what he's done, it makes it difficult for me to kind of pry into the details of what the crimes were. I've sensed that there's a little resistance to that. Would that be fair to say?
Sure. Yeah, there's a great deal of shame and grief when I've made it real for me. But I'm not ashamed that as much to tell people what I did. It doesn't seem to... I mean, I can't see what telling every small detail and every victim and what and awful things that were done to them matter or can help any journalism or anybody other than a clinician.
I mean, obviously I'm coming from a non-clinical perspective, and I think there's viewers who would feel, not that every detail needs to be gone into, but there's also a sense that because the crimes are so serious, that people would feel they kind of need you to own up to what you did, to some extent.
I'm not too sure how much more that I could actually own up to them going through 11 years of treatment and 6 years of prison just to cover what I'm feeling about this. What would you, as a representative of the community, feel Mr. Lamb would need to do to own up, to use your words, to own up to what he's done?
I think it's by saying, here's the transparency, and here's where I am now.
If it's important to you to know the details of the crime, I'd be thrilled, truly, to tell you. But the important thing is that is my past. I want that absolutely understood. Most of the crimes were as a teenager. I have about 35 of them. Before I was 18, I was just running willy-nilly in the neighborhood. That is just, it's awful. It's awful to me now, but those are the things I did. And
I sensed a certain amount of irritation from you, when we started talking about some of the crimes, and I just wondered, when he goes out into the community, he may face a large amount of publicity, and journalists doorstepping him, I think, would be a possibility. TV crews turning up on his doorstep, I think, might be a possibility. If he finds that really annoying, that may be an issue for him.
It's less annoying than it is hurtful. And perhaps the public would think, well, I need to be heard over and over again. I can find ways to bring up stuff and make me feel bad about this all the time. There's my life, but I do need to get over it too. And the treatment has let me do that. In fact, the judge asked me when he ordered the release, He said, is this just a bunch of, what was it? Oh, clinical buzzwords you're telling me? I said, no, it's just a new way of life.
The awkward truth about Coalinga is that despite the best intentions of the psychologists and social workers, most of the people here, even those in treatment, will never get out. And so the main function of this hospital has become less about treating sex offenders than containing them. Here most of them will live, in comfort and confinement, until the end of their days.
At this point, if you've been left questioning a whole lot and are in need of resolution, I'm here to provide. I don't mean to imply that personal morality is a bad thing. In fact, it's good to have a sense of what you consider right and wrong. What's important is to not let it override the morality of others and to keep it out of politics. We do this not by suppressing moral ideology, but by increasing inclusivity. By introducing a diverse array of ideas, people grow to realize that what they considered natural belief was really just their own. Another book which really convinced me to show for a deep state communist college pro-pedophile, Eugene Richardson's Epidemic Illusions on the Coloniality of Global Public Health, was revolutionary for me. He takes a very unconventional approach to convince you why your intrinsic ontology might not be so intrinsic after all. It's also the book that solved the postmodernist issue for me, because at the time, I was still on the fence of accepting that there is an objective reality because of all the harm caused by those who had so easily. Plato, the ancient philosopher who was totally, probably, might have been straight, had an allegory about people trapped in a cave. One of them is able to escape. Their whole life, everyone in the cave has only seen shadows on the wall, but this person makes it above ground. They see the sun and realize the entire time the sun has been making these shadows. They see the sun as the objective truth of the world. And when they go back down into the cave to try and convince everyone, they aren't believed. Everyone else still sees the shadows and accepts the shadows to be true. Richardson redescribes this allegory. There are still people trapped in the cave seeing nothing but shadows on the wall. But when they escape, they see the source not as the sun, but other people. They are projecting these shadows onto the wall. Another thing is that when they break free, they realize they were never actually chained. They were conditioned to never look away from the shadows.
At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn the neck round and find that some in the nest weren't chained at all, they will suffer pains, and those pains will become sharper when they realizes that those who weren't in chains impose the set of illusion they came to believe in, that their mental universe had been colonized.
Moreover, once they begin exploring beyond their cave, they don't end up finding an outside with some objective true sun. They only end up finding other caves with their own way of viewing the world. We make our own reality. And once we realize that, we can choose to associate with others who share beliefs that we personally hold higher value to, because we realize those are the beliefs we truly wish to associate with.
Are more appealing aesthetically. Some expand the motion of what we mean, some have justice as an end.
Once we get past the fact that yes, there is an objective reality, we must then become accepting of others' interpretation of it. Greater inclusion helps reduce discrimination, not of just simple discourses, but of the main discourse, class. In Bodies, Politics, and African Healing, The Matter of Maladies in Tanzania, Stacey Langwood discusses the dichotomy between the mainstream medical establishment in Tanzania with traditional healing. Because of course, traditional healers base their cures off of a number of things which the mainstream medical establishment would criticize.
The struggle between the absolutist politics of public health narratives and the hierarchical politics of healers is a struggle to maintain particular relationships and ensure the stability of particular propositions.
These two worldly perspectives are fundamentally in opposition with one another, yet so many people continue to subscribe to both.
Ironically, the friction between these positions opens bodies and disease entities to further translation, as the absolutist assertions of nurses interfere with the hierarchical claims of healers. They come to shape each other. Narratives about startled bodies and fierce needles describe a contingent and evolving pluralism. In these junctures, complicated and interdependent therapeutic ecologies begin to be visible. The coordination of doctors' assessments of symptoms, tests for malaria parasites, and evaluations of anemia, and healers' assertions about mischievous mashitani, medicinal baths, and herbal concoctions enact the subject and object of this southern Tanzanian ecology. Partial and strategic relationships constitute these hybrid bodies and disease entities. Attention to such situated connections not only contextualizes absolutist claims but also opens up a space in which to imagine less hierarchical, possibly more democratic translations.
It is possible for multiple ontologies to truly coexist with one another, creating a more pluralistic, democratic ideology of itself, which goes on to shape the internal subject and everyone positively. In referencing past movements, I've spoken about the reactions, such as the reaction to desegregation, and how the first wave of responses was to make it a moral issue. Once that was shown to be untenable, because the people were being won over, the next step was assimilation.
Do you class this as a sexual orientation or like mental disorder?
I think it's a phenomenon that happens in brains. I'm happy to accept the term disorder as much as I'm happy to accept the term sexual orientation.
I don't think you can call anything a sexual orientation when it can never be consensual. I have a child and I would in no way, shape or form would ever feel comfortable with you even looking at them.
Right.
So I think then you should have maybe therapy or something, someone to talk to try and actually see if this is something that can be rewired in your brain.
So you think it could be changed?
I don't know. This is obviously why I'm here. I'd hope so.
I had an attraction that nobody wanted to know about at that time, which was being gay.
So I'm gay. I was the only gay in school and I had a lot of bullying through that. Some people will believe that people that are gay should have therapy to sort of change that, and I don't think that's possible.
Right.
Do you think that the sexual attraction to children is similar in the way that it's something that can't be changed?
Exactly. It isn't similar in the way that it would be right or wrong to act on it.
Yeah.
It is similar probably, like, if you think about the science of it. I'm really careful. I don't like making the comparison because I think it's really stigmatizing for gay people.
So do you have therapy now?
I don't have therapy now, but I have had in the past. It's really hard to get any paedophile to talk to a therapist at all. There's lots of reasons for that. We're very frightened. We think we might get reported even if we haven't done anything.
Do you have any attraction to adults as well? Like, have you been in relationships?
Yes, and I've had adult relationships.
So can you find adults as attractive as you can children?
Pretty much.
And have you told people that you've gotten into relationships with that you've got this attraction?
A couple of times.
And how has that been received?
It's been received okay.
Essentially, when a social expectation is set for how a certain group of people are supposed to act in a society, those who break from that norm are countering the culture. It's why the 1960s was considered such a countercultural time period. So then, if queer people are considered queer because of the fact that they themselves are just inherently acting differently than the norm of society, could you consider them their own culture? Of course, the idea of queer culture would exist as a subculture within the greater culture we all live in our case, Western culture. And there's very well documented history of queer people throughout Western history. So it's not as though it's a completely separate culture of itself, it's another subculture within our Western culture. It becomes important when identifying who is and isn't in a certain subject position. Are they gay? Are they trans? And how would you know without asking? Because of associated behaviors and features, stereotypes. So then, when a certain group gets associated with certain behaviors, and they're responding with the right to just exist, of course, many of them will begin changing how they act, to distance themselves from the associated behaviors, because they don't want to be seen as a stereotype.
She is speaking.
I said the same thing. You're right. Hi, baby. Y'all better quiet down. Nothing. I've been trying to get up here all day for your gay brothers and your gay sisters in jail. They write me every motherfucking week and ask for your help. And you all don't do a goddamn thing for them. Have you ever been beaten up and raped in jail? Now think about it. They've been beaten up and raped after they haven't spent much of their money in jail to get their cell phones and try to get their sex change. The women have tried to fight for their sex changes or to become women of the women's liberation. And they write STAR, not the women's group. They do not write women. They do not write men. They write STAR because we're trying to do something for them. I have been to jail. I have been raped and beaten many times by men, heterosexual men that do not belong in the homosexual shelter. But did you do anything for them? No. You all tell me to go and hide my tail between my legs. I will not longer put up with this shit. I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all? Think about that. I do not believe in a revolution, but you all do. I believe in the gay power. I believe in us getting our rights, or else I would not be out there fighting for our rights. That's all I wanted to say to your people. If you all want to know about the people that are in jail, and do not forget Bambi Lamore and Dora Marks, Kenny Messner, and other gay people that are in jail, come and see the people at Star House on 12th Street, on 640 East 12th Street, between B and C, apartment 14. The people that are trying to do something for all of us, and not men and women that belong to a white middle class, white club. And that's what you all belong to. Revolution now! Give me a G! Give me an A! Give me a Y! Give me a P! Give me an O! Give me a W! Give me an E! Give me an R! Gay power! Louder gay power!
Even if it's how they learn to act and how they want to act, in order to earn their right to exist in the greater society, they must assimilate themselves to how that society is expecting them to act. They can also act how a normal person may act. They can act like a straight person. How many times have you seen in the media black men talking about how they have to change their voice to seem white? How recently was it that gay men were still trying to prove that not all gay men were flamboyant? How many gay men had to actually change the way they acted just so that you would know it's not all gay men? Because those were the only men being presented in the media. despite all the others who acted all sorts of different ways, just because the flamboyancy was how society expected them to act. Well, going back to the early days of the gay liberation movement, believe it or not, minor attracted people were involved. And of course, political reaction was used to completely demonize this movement based on the involvement of pedophiles. So much work has been put in to discredit and erase from history those who you could have political disagreements with, but they deserve to be named regardless. Harry Hay, Helmut Kettler, Ian Dunn, Bill Andriette, and Tony Duvere, just to name a few. I'd like to show you another clip now, this time of an openly pedophilic man speaking at a gathering of the Society for Family Planning and Sex Education.
Na závěr bych chtěl konkrétně odpovědět na otázku referátu, co mě osobně nejvíc trápí. Není to ani snad to, že nikdy nebudu mít s někým sex. Od toho mám pravou ruku. Pokud zatoužím po nějakém zpestření, tak mám levou. Vlastně nemůžu ani říct, že by mi vadilo, že je ilegální držení dětské pornografie, protože já sám si vystačím s fantaziemi. Nevadí mi snad ani to, že pravděpodobně většinu svého života strávím sám, protože myslím, že to se děje víc lidem, na to ani nemusí být člověk pedofil. Nevadí mi ani, že malému klukovi nemůžu říct, že ho miluju, protože to jsou moc silná slova pro dětská ouška. Vadí mi, jak málo s ním můžu trávit času. Vadí mi ta otázka, jestli mám vůbec právo vídat se s ním. Byl bych šťastný, kdyby jednou byla společnost schopná akceptovat, že i pedofil se může kamarádit s dítětem. A já vám děkuji za možnost zde vystoupit a za vaši pozornost.
Undoubtedly, as assimilation continued, those who were originally part of an oppressed class began joining the ruling class. Therefore, a movement cannot be based on a singular identity. There are so many people today who are part of a subject position that oppress others from that same subject position. A movement must unite all those of an oppressed class into one cohesive struggle against their oppressors and the system oppressing them all together. That is how civil rights movements have begun and succeeded in the past, and limitations were met when divisions arose again, because not everyone can assimilate. There are so many people who would prefer to stick with the culture they have learned and associated with their whole life. Why wouldn't they? There are so many people who couldn't assimilate because the features they have marked them no matter what they did, such as racial minorities. There are those who could not assimilate because they just simply could not live without expressing their true feelings, such as minor attracted people, because they can never express their love without being targeted so hatefully. After all, if they really are their own subculture, couldn't you consider an erasure of culture genocide? Well, we're on the internet, so of course I was going to bring up the Nazis at some point. We all acknowledge and accept and aren't denying the Holocaust, right? I just want to make sure. Okay, moving on. Before they came into power, they actually had to take power. It didn't just fall into their lap. Would you be surprised to hear that J.K. Rowling is denying their atrocities on Twitter? Not the ones you might be thinking of. She's fully accepting of the Holocaust, of course. She's willing to use it in any of her arguments, but she's denying their sexual victims. See, you might not have known this, but Germany in the 1900s was a forefront for the early sexual liberation movement. There were many openly transgender and homosexual people just wandering the streets. Many institutes studying human sexuality were open as well. And these people and institutes were prime targets for the Nazi Party during their early campaigns, condemning what they saw as immorality corrupting German society. The 1930s saw thousands of books burned from the Institute for Sexual Science. Homosexuals were specifically targeted by the Nazi regime in an effort to have a moral platform. Homosexuality was seen as a Jewish plot to subvert the German natural order. Again, having a view of natural order of things. When some people fall out of that natural order, it's easy to see them as failures, malfunctions, and target them for political motivations. Would you be surprised to hear that the first openly gay politician in modern history was Hitler's best friend? Ernst Röhm was outed by the Social Democratic Party in an attempt to make the Nazis look bad by having them appear to be controlled by the gays. The problem of personal morality can hardly be exemplified clearer than this. Röhm was Hitler's best friend. It didn't matter what his politics were. He stuck around, that is, until political circumstances changed, and to save face, he had Röhm killed. Does it matter what he thought when he ordered this to be carried out? Does it matter if he had regrets about any of them, including Röhm? Morally, sure. But it's how it matters politically that shaped millions of lives. Of course, the Nazis still came into power when the main opposition was resorting to their level. I focus on their sexual victims because I feel they've gone far too overlooked throughout history. But of course, morality was weighed against the Jews as well, and not just in relation to homosexuality. You might have heard of the Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, considered the prelude to the Holocaust. Its origins actually lie in the assassination of a German politician at the time by a Jewish teenager named Herschel Grynszpan. Once he was pronounced dead, just days later, riots broke out, targeting Jewish businesses, synagogues, homes, and hospitals, and more, giving to the name Night of Broken Glass because of the images of all the glass shattered on the street. It became a pretext for the arrest of over 30,000 Jews, sending them to concentration camps. Jewish people had long been singled out as some other who needed to be morally repudiated, and the Nazis seized on this hateful sentiment like it did so many others. Just days after the riots broke out, Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels said that they were
spontaneous manifestations of indignation against the murder of Erich von Rath by the young Jew Grynszpan.
Immediately it became about the morally right response, which is, of course, to protect your loved ones against the evil out there that get all of us. Grynszpan wasn't acting out some master plan to liberate everyone, and he certainly wasn't trying to make matters worse. Interestingly, it seems that his legal defense was going to claim that he was in a homosexual relationship with the politician he killed, so that
the murder could be presented not as a political act, but as a cause passionnel, a lover's quarrel, in which the German diplomat could be judged incidentally as having seduced a minor. Mauro Girafari shared the fears of the Grynszpan committee at the time of Kristallnacht, that a political trial would be a catastrophe for the Jews of Germany and elsewhere. By adopting this legal strategy, they hoped to diffuse the affair and also reduce the penalty drastically, possibly even prompting a suspended sentence.
in actuality, it turned out to just be a plan concocted by his defense lawyer, and Grynszpan himself continued to reaffirm that he killed von Rath in protest of Nazi Jewish policy. In any case, a way forward that did not blend politics and morality was written, at the time, in response to the whole situation by a man named Leon Trotsky.
In the moral sense, although not for his mode of action, Grynszpan may serve as an example for every young revolutionist. Our open moral solidarity with Grynszpan gives us an added right to say to all the other would-be Grynszpans, to all those capable of self-sacrifice in the struggle against despotism and bestiality, seek another road. Not the lone avenger, but only a great revolutionary mass movement can free the oppressed. A movement that will leave no remnant of the entire structure of class exploitation, national oppression, and racial persecution.
One of the names I mentioned earlier was Helmut Kentler. He was a German sexologist who, in the 60s, conducted a very controversial experiment, placing foster children into foster care of minor attracted parents. I want you to think about this study because even if you came into this video with an accepting mind, I'm sure this is the most apprehensive you've been at any point. The 1960s was a hotbed of psychological torture described as experiments, so there's no denying the facts which surround Helmut Kentler. one of the foster parents who he sent children to abused them. They specifically took in children with certain conditions, emotionally manipulated them, and left them with social difficulties years later. 2 of his foster children would later go on to sue the government for allowing this to continue their whole lives. They were able to win compensation for themselves. Why then would I consider Helmut Kentler as one of the pioneers of the early sexual liberation movement, who we shouldn't forget? Well, like I said, one of the parent Kentler chose to send children to was abusive, but he sent tons of kids to an abundance of parents. So then, what were the results of his entire study? That's another issue, because no official results were ever released. The study, as you might have guessed, was so controversial, Kentler got punched in the face for it. Most documents pertaining to the study are still locked away in a basement. We don't know much about the study at all, except, like I said, only 2 children have ever come forward claiming abuse, both of which come from the same foster parent. What we do know is what Kentler represents politically, because when one of the foster children, Marco, began to try to get accountability for their abuse, they were met with
a man named Christoph Schwinn, who referred to himself as Marco's friend. Initially, I assumed that he was Marco's lawyer. Then I looked him up online and saw that he'd received a PhD in philosophy, publishing a dissertation called Homesickness, Heroes, Cheerfulness. Nietzsche's path to becoming a superhero. He worked for the Alternative for Germany, Germany's right-wing party, as an advisor for education and cultural policy. The party was recently investigated by Germany's Domestic Intelligence Agency for undermining democracy by, among other things, minimizing the crimes of the Nazis. The party's co-leader has called the era just a speck of bird poop in more than 1,000 years of successful German history.
Once the survivors received their compensation, it became clear that the case meant more to others than it did to them.
From the perspective of an AfD politician, Marco's life story was expedient, a tale about the ways in which the German left had gotten sexual politics wrong. At meetings of the German parliament, members of the AfD rallied around Kentler's case as a way of forcing left-wing politicians to address history that did not reflect well on their parties, but also as a barely disguised vehicle for impunging homosexuality. An advocacy group affiliated with the AfD held Stop Kentler Sex Education rallies to protest the ways that sexuality is currently taught in German schools. Kentler's criminal pedophile spirit lives on unbroken in today's sex education. A brochure printed by the organization explained, history seemed to be looping back on itself. Right-wing politicians were calling for a return of the kind of terribly dangerous upbringing against which Kentler had rebelled. In its party manifesto, the AfD states that it is committed to the traditional family as a guiding principle, an idea that it associates with the maintenance of Germans' cultural identity and power to counteract the influx of immigrants to Germany. The only mid- and long-term solution, the AfD program says, is to attain a higher birth rate by the native population. Christoph Schwinn, the AfD advisor, had urged Marco and Sven to keep fighting, but Marco couldn't understand why.
We have gotten our wishes, so there's no point in further irritating or tyrannizing the Senate,
he told me. But Schwinn kept pushing him. Marco said, Schwinn denies this.
Then I slowly got suspicious. I asked myself, what else would I want? That's when I got the feeling that the AfD just wants to use me, to play me up. And I said, I don't want to be a political tool. I don't want to get pulled into an election campaign.
He dropped his lawsuit and accepted the Senate's offer. His only remaining goal is that in the upcoming report, all the names of people involved in carrying out Kentler's experiment be revealed. Schwinn said that he had been supporting Marco as a private person, not on behalf of the AfD. He also told me,
I have new ideas, but for Marco, it's over. I can't think of any clearer way to present the idea that pedophiles are some less than human population is nothing but harmful than by showing you how the Nazis did it to come into power, and that after them, German politicians to this day are continuing to double down on the same rhetoric by using a caricature of a man from the 60s sexual liberation movement. Whatever moral qualms you might have with any of those figures, you can put them aside and see how politically they are being used to do the exact same thing the Nazis did back in the 30s. And by the way, if you're still on the fence about a minor attracted person being a foster parent, let me remind you of the very first study that I opened up this video with. Or maybe the first clip I showed you of a minor attracted person talking about their volunteering with children. Or maybe the more recent clip I showed you of a minor attracted person talking about friendships with children. Really? Do I have to go further? No, you're right. As always, you're right. We should hear it directly from a minor attracted foster parent themselves.
Most people would see me as guy. You know, a guy, not somebody who's actually attracted to children. Through my teenage years, I would say I was extremely depressed, very angry. My attraction wasn't aging with me. It was staying in that same area of, say, 7 to, say, 12, and usually at the lower end. They may think of me as a monster, a freak, whatever, but the way that they feel about me, I've felt worse for myself. Everybody always tries to talk about a cure, and I got news for you. If there was ever a cure for something like this, I'd be in line. This attraction makes your life a living hell, makes you an outcast. My wife and I, we've done foster care, actually, and we've had some great experiences with it. We were able to make some children who may have started out having a really rough life have a lot of fun. A young boy who was in our care at the time, he was 8 years old. And I was trying to deal with, my own feelings. Made it really tough, and unfortunately I reached for the internet. Most of the pictures that I searched out were of boys swimming or in their underwear. I wanted to see them happy. I saw some pictures online that were, of children being hurt, but they're not the pictures that I was interested in. The police came to my house. I admitted to what I had done. I think if I could do it all over again, at least that part would be much different. They searched my computer, they found what I had. They took a lot of rolls of film that had absolutely nothing to do with what happened. We can never get them back. I had a total of 25 pictures that were considered illegal and pornographic. And I was charged for every one of them. The more open a person can be, I think, at least for me, the more happy I am. If I can be totally open, I'm pretty happy with myself then. And, I mean, I'm not saying that happy people don't do stupid things, but I think that happy people tend to not want to hurt others. We fought like crazy for him. I didn't think that they would just automatically take him because he was adopted at the time. Our last visit with him was kind of a goodbye visit. Extremely tough for me. Extremely tough for Lori. For my wife. But his social worker actually took me aside and said to me, sat me down and said, Bobby, this situation is horrible. But I do know that you did not touch him in any sexual way. And I broke down right there. because that's all I had been telling people all along. And, you know, if they would have understood that, you know, to begin with, and just said, okay, you know what, you broke the law. Okay, if you have to go to jail or if you have to go to prison, so be it. Why take him out of a home where he was extremely happy?
After everything I've said and shown you, what's left to convince you? We still have people who don't trust gays around their kids, so I can understand hesitancy for sure, but if you're still completely opposed to the idea of even opening up avenues for minor attracted people, then I have to call you out on being part of the problem.
Coming out. That's the most important thing that I could ever do. It tells me that I'm alive. It tells me that I have a place in this world. What coming out means, it means that I'm not afraid.
By now, if you're not thinking about minor attracted people, morality, politics, and just society overall, you're probably thinking about how you're totally gonna clown on me, and I look forward to it. I myself am very politically active, being a member of a youth organization known as the IYSC. I joined them because they have a very well-rounded idea of the separation between morality and politics. Among other things, of course, but an example of what they handle well can be seen in their response to the arrest of a whistleblower named Joshua Scholl, who is also minor attracted.
The sentence is all the more striking, given the flimsy character of the case against Schulte, who maintains his innocence. There was sufficient doubt over his guilt for a jury to be unable to reach agreement on the Espionage Act and national security charges in a first trial of Schulte in 2020, resulting in a mistrial. Schulte has stated that he was fitted up because the government was desperate to find a scapegoat for the CIA data breach. As a disgruntled and idiosyncratic former CIA employee, he was identified as a suspect almost immediately after WikiLeaks began publishing the material in March of 2017. Shortly thereafter, he was indicted on charges of possession of child pornography. Whatever their veracity, those charges were clearly aimed at ensnaring Schulte in the legal system, as the government sought to build a case. It took more than a year for the Department of Justice to cobble together an indictment against Schulte over the CIA leak.
As a matter of fact, did you know that in 2022, the Department of Justice passed new regulations stating that a journalist's records were not to be seized? This was in the wake of a scandal. There was a notable exception to this rule, however, and I'm sure you can guess what it was. One journalist named James Gordon Meeks was the target of this exception. They were arrested over child pornography. This was a journalist who was very vocal about United States foreign policy and documenting such actions, of course. Again, you may have very strong feelings about the material in question here, but taking out morality, and can you really say that it wasn't targeted? The fact that an exception to the rule limiting journalists' records being seized was allowed must be talked about. Any exception is going to allow for freedom of the press to be limited. And even then, who decides what is a journalist? If anyone under the law is not considered a journalist, then it doesn't matter if there was an exception. The law doesn't protect them at all. They could always have been prosecuted simply for virtue of not being affiliated by a massive media organization willing to back them up. Independent journalists can just be considered not journalists at all and have any of their records seized. This is why politics is so important. It's so easy to suddenly target someone when they are outed for being a minor attracted person. Even a United Nations Special Weapons Commission expert can have their constitutional rights violated, their passport seized when they try to fly out of the country. Scott Ritter was an open critic of the invasions in the Middle East back in the early 2000s. So you tell me whether or not his current status, having his passport seized and unable to leave the country, is politically targeted, or if he just happened to be unlucky.
He was charged in June 2001 with trying to set up a meeting with an undercover police officer posing as a 16-year-old girl. the charge was dismissed and the record was sealed. Ritter was arrested again in November 2009. Ritter rejected a plea bargain and was found guilty of all but the criminal attempt count. Ritter maintains that he never engaged with an actual minor online, and there's no evidence to suggest that he did, beyond his interactions with undercover police officers in chat rooms for over 18-year-olds. In the days leading up to Ritter's sentencing in the last week of October, a significant development suddenly brought him new hope. Responding to an appeal from Ritter's lawyers, a panel of appellate judges in New York ruled unanimously that the files from his 2001 arrest should never have been unsealed and used in his trial.
Regardless of whether or not minor attracted people are involved, I feel this is a great example as to why the mainstream narrative should just always be questioned. For minor attracted people specifically, organizations like Before You Act have held in-person workshops helping minor attracted people come to terms and accepting their attractions. They are also the organization founded by the man who I showed you a clip of earlier. I single Before You Act out because most minor attracted communities are currently online, so it's very special to see one holding in-person meetings. Regardless, any support, any organization, whether online, such as VERPED.
A virtuous paedophile is someone who has a sexual attraction to children, but who has decided that that shouldn't mean that they would abuse a child.
Or in person, such as Before You Act, would be entirely beneficial. It would show that there is increasing support for these people. They also are working tirelessly to publish a quarterly journal review for any minor attracted scientific literature. It is very beneficial for anyone who wishes to read but is not well versed in the technical jargon for any science, psychology, neurology, such and such. They are summaries of scientific publications. The point is to organize, because nothing can truly be done alone. That's why these organizations are so impactful. There shouldn't be any hesitancy for me to say that pedophiles have rights. When it comes to organizations waging battles against these unjust laws overall, the Alliance for Constitutional Sex Offense Laws is one I would recommend. They hold emotional support meetings for anyone who has been irreparably harmed by these unjust laws, regardless of whether they are minor attracted or not. Going even further, they let the family members and loved ones for those harmed also attend these meetings, because they understand that the emotional stress put onto them is just as important. They've worked to organize massive opposition to these sex-based, morally justified legislations, even just as recently as this month. They hold annual conferences for anyone to attend and learn about what they do. If you are hoping to get involved and help change the current culture, then either of these three organizations I listed would be where I recommend starting, for a variety of reasons. I'd like to think that, above all else, it is by this point where I've likely convinced you to start accepting voices from these communities you have likely always thought deserved to be shut out. Earlier I referenced Alan Walker's book, A Long Dark Shadow. Should we finally get into the contents and hear what these minor attracted people themselves have to say?
Hugo and his siblings were raised by their father in a religious community, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The LDS Church is famously conservative. Writings by elders describe, quote, serious transgressions, unquote, that can lead to excommunications include, for example, homosexual relations, transsexual operation, and false swearing. Although Hugo had close relationships with his father and brothers and a strong connection to his church, given the restrictive environment in which he was raised, he did not feel able to share his growing concerns about the attractions he was experiencing with anyone else. As a result, these attractions made him feel alone. Hugo's growing sense of alienation was heightened by the fact that he had never before heard of an individual who shared these attractions who had not committed a sexual offense. Hence, the questions he was asking himself about his attractions made him wonder if he was monstrous, a child molester waiting to happen. Hugo's anxieties reached their peak at Christmas time when he was 17. He was going on a trip with his father, and at the airport, Hugo saw a boy of about 12. The boy caught Hugo's attention. He recalled thinking the boy was
super cute.
At that moment, Hugo realized his fears were true.
Oh shit.
He thought,
I think I'm a pedophile. I think I'm attracted to kids.
felt devastated upon his confrontation with this knowledge about himself. In that moment, Hugo recalled he
didn't really want to live.
Although Hugo overcame his feelings of not wanting to live, he explained his reasoning for these negative feelings in our interview.
Just for a while, I thought I was the only one.
He told me.
It was just so silly, but I definitely felt that way.
I asked him, "You felt you were the only one?" He replied,
Like, person who was attracted to kids who didn't act on it.
Hugo explained,
I just felt like I was combating it alone, you know? I felt like it was difficult because it was a hard thought to have. I don't know if I fully believed it or not, but I definitely had the thought at times that it would be impossible for other people to have the same feelings. Throughout the book, Alan makes connections through the lived experiences as a member of the LGBT community, and is surprised just by how many similarities there are. It becomes clear early on, as Alan realizes himself, that the socially constructed idea of who minor attracted people are, that they are so different from the rest of us, is nothing more than a lie. Alan's book is a major breakthrough for sure in uplifting minor attracted voices, yet I have some qualms with it as well. One of the major points I've been making is that the perspective of someone writing about a community ends up distorting the interpretations of what that community was actually saying or expressing. I don't want to pretend that Alan was intending for anything else. Of course, as a college professor, this was meant mostly to be read within academic circles. However, it continues to fall under the flaw of academia. Throughout the book, there are comparisons and references to sexologists, sociologists, different theories and what they might reflect upon the lived experiences for these minor attracted people, how a certain social theory might apply to something they said at a certain point. It's very separated. It feels as though you are reading a report about them, which you are. But I don't want to feel that way. I want to know what these people felt, and I want to relate to understand exactly what those feelings were. I don't want to just compare it to some Erik Erikson theory from 100 years ago. Because of this, I'd like to shift our attention to some passages written long before Alan's work. I feel not only have they been intentionally overlooked, but that their prominence during their own time shows just how important they are even to this day and deserve to be recognized for that. Tom O'Carroll was a pro-pedophile rights activist in Great Britain during the 1970s, having published his work, Pedophilia, the Radical Case, in 1980.
I could not believe that it was right that the love inside me should be repressed, crushed, aborted. It had to be there for a purpose. It had to be there to do good with. I am not a Christian. I do not believe in God, but at times I wish I did, because then at least I could appeal to the idea that I have been made as I am, as part of His great purpose, and my love made accordingly. I am profoundly sure that my innermost feelings towards children are benevolent. I see no inherent contradiction between the sexual nature of my love and the affectional aspect of it. The two are complementary. The problem lies in the obstacle society puts between me and the expression of my best intentions towards children.
The major problem we seem to have found ourselves in is that we somehow got into our heads that, despite what should be obvious, minor attracted people are only sexually attracted to children, despite the fact that we all have a broad spectrum of attractions which form our love. In a study conducted by Mark Jean, minor attracted people were asked about different levels of love, and whether or not they felt they even had fallen in love with children. 72% of the participants reported having fallen in love with a child who was 14 or younger, while being 18 or older themselves. Participants reported stronger attachment than infatuation for children. The spectrum for attraction goes far beyond whether it's sexual or romantic, as many of you are probably aware. People of all sexualities have different age range attractions, as porn categories should prove. Teens, MILFs, DILFs, and JILF categories exist because there are different attractions to different ages. These attractions are not even exclusive to one another, as many people can have different attractions to different categories. And again, this is not limited to sexuality. How many times have you seen a meme online about someone dating someone much older than them, and only being in it for the inheritance or some shit like that. The idea that it could actually be love is so foreign to so many people because the idea of such a wide age gap is unnatural to them. No one can actually feel attracted, sexual, romantic, or anything else because that's an age gap that's way too big for it to make sense. But it's part of the same issue that minor attracted people face, although to a much lesser scale. People just can't accept it because it doesn't seem natural to them. But that's the idea. There's nothing that is natural. So many people are just born however they are. There's no destined plan guiding out how people are birthed. No architect is designing people's bodies and minds. Some people are attracted to those much older than them. Some people are attracted to people much younger than them. We need to start accepting that. Haven't you even heard of the president of France? Oh no, his former teacher groomed him. But are we really going to deny him his autonomy? At this point, can we not accept that love is love? And that Macron has so many other qualities worth criticizing, such as... I understand the hesitancy to accept such large age gaps, such as Seinfeld and Shoshana Lunstein-Gross, but what we can't do is pretend to speak for them. We can't ignore what the people we claim to be in favor of are saying themselves, how they genuinely feel about their own situation.
I'm happy I got to have the relationship, but LA was a really lonely existence for me.
Clearly, there were problems. Seinfeld's busy schedule left Shoshana feeling neglected. It's very similar to Elvis and Priscilla, a relationship you might be more familiar with. And just like Elvis and Priscilla, with their large age gap, Elvis being 24 when he met Priscilla at age 14, Priscilla still loved him. There's a whole movie about it. She did not overlook his flaws in her reflective memoir, which you can also read on your own. But that doesn't change that despite his flaws, she loved him. And to ignore that part in favor of a view that shows one-sided evil men preying on women is very similar to how in the 90s we had this image of predatory homosexuals.
Hey, anybody come at you yet? Anybody get to you yet? Hey, we all need friends in here. I could be a friend to you. Hey. Hard to get. I like that.
The reason why prison was seen as such a hot spot for rape, because people were learning about how much gay sex was happening in prison. And of course, there's no way it could have been consensual. All that gay sex, those men had been preying on these straight men. I'm really tired of having to point out so many different parallels, and I hope that really this is the last one. It makes things easier for us to assume that all these people share the same predatory traits because it explains all their other negative flaws. But the truth is that human relationships are so much more complex than that, and it's why, say it with me now, that we can't judge others based on our own morality. I think it's finally time we talk about Roman Polanski. There's no denying it was rape, okay? First of all, let's just get that over with. He did rape a little girl, in fact. Now, if you are someone who has heard about this case, let me ask, have you actually heard what her take on it was? Because as she points out herself, there's been a very noticeable lack in one specific perspective.
Opinions on the Polanski case go something like this. He was a vile pedophile whose power allowed him to escape the long arm of the law. Or he was a troubled man whose own horrific background did not allow him to gauge the difference between a child and a young woman. And the girl, she was an innocent victim. Or no, she was a cunning Lolita. Or perhaps most commonly, she was a reluctant but ultimately willing player in the crazy ambitions of her stage mother, who wanted her little girl to be a star. Who was the predator? Who was the prey? We were all suspect. Was Roman a rapist? Had my mother set up the famous director to blackmail him, using her daughter as bait? The arguments went on and on and on. Maybe the only person who lived through that time, who has not weighed in on that crime and its aftermath in any significant way, is me. Which is why I thought it might be a good idea to tell my story.
To this day, Samantha Geimer has continued to defend Polanski, not because there isn't genuine trauma from the ordeal, but because she recognizes the man behind the scandal. Do you have any idea how much courage it takes to come out and say, yes, that man raped me, but you're the one going too far?
And it's interesting that you have decided to forgive the man responsible for what happened to you when you were 13 years old. Why have you decided to do that?
Well, I forgave him many, many years ago, almost immediately after it had happened. So I think forgiveness doesn't come hard to me. And I was having so much other trouble in life due to the court and the media that really overtook and overwhelmed my whole family.
The problem, Sam, that you had with the Polanski situation was that he fled the country before he was due to be sentenced. He effectively evaded justice, evaded doing his time for what he did to you, and notwithstanding your forgiveness, which says a lot about you, there is a reality check here that he was allowed to abscond from America, to lead a very luxurious life in France, to carry on making movies.
He came back to America and served 42 days in prison and was released and was supposed to be sentenced to time served. But we had a very corrupt judge who was interested only in his own celebrity. So after being lied to several times and threatened with 50 years in jail on a promise of I'll let you out a few weeks later, he went home to France. And I'm glad he did. And I think, anybody would have done the same in his situation. And as for his work and his art and Hollywood and their appreciation of it, I don't really think that has anything to do with me. So I don't have any grudges or bad feelings that his work is appreciated.
The reason that I guess it's come up is because Harvey Weinstein has obviously been at the center of this huge growing scandal in the last 10 days, and very famous Hollywood powerful producer.
Well, I don't know if he created that environment. I think that was the environment. Clearly, that still is the environment. And it's just sad because here in America, we have a lot of sexism. And I think that women who feel like they want to be in that industry just take it in stride, like that's what they have to do to work. And I don't know if that's Roman's fault. I would blame that on, many, many more people than him. And I think it's about time that it's called out so there won't be any more victims and people, women and men, start being treated fairly and not objectified.
And what should happen to Roman Polanski?
Well, as far as how it's affected me, what he did not affect me greatly. What happened with the court and the media traumatized my whole family, changed all our lives. I mean, my mother had to leave her career. It was one of those life-changing things that happened with the court and the media. As far as what he did, things were much different in the 70s, and I don't think I thought it was as much of a big deal as everybody else did. And what I'd like to see done is the misconduct in my case investigated so we can show that the judge lied, show that Roman served his sentence, and that tried to do the right thing. He apologized, he confessed, he served his time. And even in the intro, you said it was at a party. It was on a photo shoot. There's just so much misinformation, which is why I wrote my book, The Girl, trying to tell the truth of the story from my perspective. But I would like them to investigate the misconduct, sentence him to time served, dismiss the case, whatever they could do to put an end to this before I have to explain it to my granddaughter. I mean, Sam, it's been 40 years. Right. I was a teenager. I was sexually active. I was not as traumatized by that, by the sex as everyone would like me to be. But that's just who I am. So, and I'm not aggrieved about the way my life has turned out. When you have a dishonest judge who lies and calls reporters and tells the attorneys what to say in court when he's already decided what his judgment is going to be. Isn't our justice system here? I mean, in America, we're supposed to have a great justice system. My father was a criminal defense attorney, and I think a judge and a district attorney and the misconduct that occurred in my case is far worse than what happened to me by a director in the 70s who isn't held to the kind of standard I think, a judge on the superior court should be.
She never tried to pretend that there wasn't any actual damage done to her. She sued him for civil damages and brought attention to when he didn't pay her all the way. Her struggle has been to continue to get her say out there, because people keep on attacking Polanski as if they are defending her when they ignore everything she has said, that Polanski has been targeted too far, that Polanski himself has become victimized by a government trying to make itself look good by cracking down on the sex scandal.
In the newly disclosed emails, one judge on the Los Angeles County Superior Court indicated that if Mr. Polanski, a fugitive, returned to the United States for a hearing, the judge might be compelled to free him because of the conduct of Lawrence A. Riddenban, the judge who handled the case in the 1970s and who died in 1993. The judge expressing concern, Larry P. Fidler, also said he feared a public backlash if he ruled in Mr. Polanski's favor.
Since the law was on his side because of Rittenban's conduct, I was convinced I was toast if he ever came back, and my career would be over.
Judge Fidler wrote to the court's public information officer in a June 9, 2008 email obtained separately by the New York Times and by Mr. Polanski's lawyers.
I've told several judges over the years that I had pity for any judge getting that case.
Judge Fidler said, and called it poison.
Again, using the sex scandals for political implications. And she recognized that, and she spoke out against it, and no one cares about what she says, even though she is the survivor. It does no justice to consider Polanski a pedophile because his rape does not represent pedophiles. Speak about the power he held, the social dynamic he was a part of, and don't ignore the perspective of his survivor, the political scandal that ensued. Minor attracted people are just people, no less than the rest of us. Some of them, like Polanski, will commit horrible acts. Most will not. When we refer to any figures throughout history, we reference how they've affected us. It's why nobody cares that Martin Luther King Jr. might have been a womanizer, because that only matters to those who were specifically involved. The policies he fought for are what affect everyone else. What affects us. I know fully well MLK Jr.'s letter to a gay teenager telling him to seek out psychiatry. It's hurtful, and it affected people, but their policies had such wider effects, and it's those that we focus on, specifically because of that.
You knew Martin Luther King. You met Martin Luther King, or at least spoke with him. Did he ever verbalize, or I guess you could assume, his knowledge of the role of gay people within the Black Civil Rights Movement? Because really, I guess when you ran into him, it may have just been strategy sessions or general meetings, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Obviously, one of his people organized the March on Washington was
right. I know more of the people around him more so than Dr. King, and no, I didn't get a sense. I think that the sense I got was that Dr. King wasn't very comfortable with the gay people in the movement, and I know he wasn't very comfortable with Bayard Rustin. So that to some degree, Bayard, that's why Bayard had such a back seat. Right. I mean, he had a crucial role, but it just was behind the scenes in the process. So that's all I can say about that.
Did you see that? You knew this from the actions, or did you see his thought process or his reaction to certain issues or gay people, or?
No, I really didn't see that. I mean, I don't think it was.
You just knew that he was a little.
I know that he wasn't that comfortable with Bayard more than anything else, and I knew that because John was. It's probably. I don't know. I really don't know. I can't say. I mean, much of what I knew about that had to do with the fact that John worked for Bayard for a summer. John Donne worked with Bayard Rustin for some.
For a
I
summer,
don't know, yeah.
was this after?
Because you know, those kinds of issues were. I mean, it was to some degree like with me and John, wherein the relationship was there, the focus was on the movement. And whenever we interact with people, if they were not gay, it was mostly about the movement. So what people's personal reactions or responses were, I had no clue.
But when John worked, I guess you heard through John that when John worked for Bayard, he saw things which would indicate this discomfort.
Yeah, Dr. King was not very comfortable with I mean, Bayard was not closeted by any means.
well, how was he not? Was he just flamboyant?
Bayard was a bit flamboyant.
Yeah. And he went out to the clubs and had fun or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
So he wasn't hiding it. He wasn't conforming.
No, he wasn't hiding it. Bayard would.
I could pick out any point in history, such as the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910, which has since kept sex work illegal in the United States. However, its full title is an act to further regulate interstate and foreign commerce by prohibiting the transportation therein for immoral purposes of women and girls, and for other purposes. How vague. Other than just prostitution, it allowed for people to be prosecuted for unlawful premarital, extramarital, and interracial relationships. Of course, cases are brought before the Supreme Court to interpret the ambiguity of this law, but the ambiguity was intentional. It was based on moral principles. One of the first major cases was Athenasaw versus United States, where the Supreme Court ruled in 1913 that not only was the word debauchery valid within the law and not too vague, but that it was to mean any sexual immorality.
It is true that the court did not give to the word debauchery or to the purpose of the statute the limited definition and extent contended for by defendants, nor did the court make the guilt of the defendants to depend upon having the intent themselves to debauch the girl or to intend that someone else should do so. In the view of the court, the statute had a more comprehensive prohibition and was designed to reach acts which might ultimately lead to that phase of debauchery which consisted in sexual actions. The general expressions of the court, however, were qualified to meet and not go beyond the conduct of the defendants. The court put it to the jury to consider whether the employment to which the defendants called the girl and the influences with which they surrounded her tended to induce her to give herself up to a condition of debauchery, which eventually and naturally would lead to a course of immorality sexually.
The Supreme Court had agreed with the position put forth by the lower courts in that
the term debauchery is not a legal or technical term. There is no allegation that the defendants brought her here with the purpose or intent to debauch her, but to induce her or entice her, or influence her to enter upon a course of debauchery. The term debauchery is not a legal or technical term. To debauch is to corrupt in moral or principles, to lead astray morally into dishonest and vicious practices, to corrupt, to lead into unchastity, to debauch. Debauchery then is an excessive indulgence of the body, licentiousness, drunkenness, corruption of innocence, taking up vicious habits. The term debauchery, as used in this statute, has an idea of sexual immorality. That is, it has the idea of a life which will lead eventually or tends to lead to sexual immorality. Not necessarily drunkenness or immorality, but here it leads to the question in this case as to whether or not the influences in which this girl was surrounded by the employment which they called her to did not tend to induce her to give herself up to a condition of debauchery which eventually, necessarily, and naturally would lead to a course of immorality sexually.
Over time, the intentional vagueness of the law allowed for moral belief to expand it further and further. In Caminetti versus United States, the court ruled that any consensual sex outside of marriage could fall under the immoral practices section of the law. In Cleveland versus United States, the court ruled that even if they were all married, if it was a polygamous marriage, they could still be arrested. The most recent case of significance regarding this law was Wyatt versus United States, when in 1960 the court ruled that victims, again, interracial marriage was one of the targets of this law. Victims could be compelled to testify against their spouse, an exception to the common law spousal privilege rule you might have heard of. This is just one example of a morally based law still in place in our modern society. Moral laws are exactly what have been used to shape social perceptions of marginalized communities, with censorship of the media and restrictions on certain portrayals.
Now I realize here I'm stepping into a vicious debate that's been going on for decades about the difference between romance and erotica. What is the difference between romance and erotica? I got so curious about this that I actually contacted the English departments of Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, and I was surprised that they pretty much all agreed on a definition that romance is for good girls and erotica is for sluts. Pornography, of course, is for men. There's a buck-wild debate from 1987 between romance titans Jackie Collins and Barbara Cartland, who between them sold more than 1 billion books. The debate gets, well, you kind of just have to see it to believe it.
It's evil, really. We've perfected the books that you write, quite frankly.
Barbara Cartland says that Jackie Collins' books are evil. Why? Because they have sex scenes.
Well, I really don't think there's anything disgusting about naked people rolling around on beds. I thought that's what you're supposed to do when you're married. How do you know?
And according to Cartland, women's fiction shouldn't have sex scenes because A, think of the children.
Have you ever thought of the effects it has on young people?
Yes, they love it. And
But
they
that
say,
is what is
I was
wrong.
reading it under...
2, it's helping the perverts.
Don't you think it has helped the perverts? It has.
And D, according to Cartland, we should encourage purity for women. That is, asexuality.
You know, I believe in purity for women, and this is the thing I've been fighting for.
It's a classic good girls versus sluts debate.
All this awful abuse of children, all that comes from a permissive society.
There's something so surreal about what I can only describe as an 80-year-old woman in clown drag lecturing everyone about sexual purity. Like, what is this? The British aren't coming. The British aren't coming. Cartland endorses the Victorian viewpoint that women, ladies, are asexual.
You were a lady. You were dressed in China. You were something perfect, slightly sacred.
In the logic of fantasy, a rich man is a high-value man, especially to us vulgar Americans. To an old-fashioned English woman like Barbara Cartland, the ideal romantic hero is preferably a peer of the realm, a disgraceful duke, a wicked marquis, an elusive earl. In desperate times, we might even settle for a cruel count. When his lordship bestows upon you lavish gifts, despite your protests and disavowals, the gifts are proof that he desires you, that you are as enticing as any beautiful, expensive object. In the 1980s, a common radical feminist view was that male and female are not natural categories at all, but that they're constructed through violence and exploitation, analogous to bourgeoisie and proletariat. Radical feminist Catherine McKinnon says, male and female are created through the erotization of dominance and submission. Man f***s woman, subject, verb, object. Notice how at odds this is with J.K. Rowling's formulation, sex is real, which some radical feminists would once have considered the constitutive statement of sexism. There's been a return to anatomical destiny lately in the form of TERFism, that is, post-feminist conservative bigotry against trans people. Rowling's transphobic arguments often hinge on an assumption that males are natural predators and females are natural prey. Or as alien sex inspector Maya Forstater puts it, in the context of prisons, it is a hole that matters. Women have a hole which men want to penetrate. Bluntly, the reason we have men in women's prisons is to keep the men away from the holes. This is anatomical destiny at the kindergarten level. Woman equals hole, man equals pole. Therefore, man equals predator, woman equals prey.
I like the pole and the hole.
TERFs think the Omegaverse is real, that men are anatomical alphas and women are anatomical omegas. Even if there is an anatomical disposition of men to sadism and women to masochism, Disposition is not destiny. Both men and women are anatomically capable of being the hammer or the anvil, the predator or the prey. So I think that feminists are mostly correct to point to the history of male social dominance as the reason for default gendered roles. Until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, English women were subject to a system called coverture, meaning that when a woman married, her entire legal existence was subsumed under that of her husband, and she effectively lost the right to own property or make contracts. In the US, it was only as recently as 1974 that women won the right to open independent bank accounts. The same year, they started having sexual fantasies. Amazing. So historically, the erotic and economic fates of women have been fused. It's the key to historical romance novels like Pride and Prejudice, where the tension is between Elizabeth's desire for a marriage of love and her economic need for a marriage of security. Incels like to complain about female hypergamy, and Mr. Bennet sits around making sarcastic quips about it. That's right, we're coming from Mr. Bennet in this video. Nothing is sacred. But women's preference for wealthy, powerful partners is the result of gender roles that make women dependent and subservient. Women are not biologically attracted to providers. Elizabeth and then Lydia are initially attracted to Wickham, even though he has no money. In Titanic, upper-class Rose is attracted to working-class Leo. In Wuthering Heights, Catherine is attracted to feral dog boy Heathcliff. And in Twilight, Bella is attracted to feral dog boy Jacob. Women are attracted to disempowered and impoverished men all the time. But because of their social and economic dependence, for most of history, a story about a woman who loves a lower-class man is not a romance. It's a tragedy. Catherine says, "It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff. If the boy is poor, there's no room on the door." Religion and ritual impose order on the world, creating distinctions between the sacred and the profane. It sounds weird to say that sex and violence are sacred, because aren't sex and violence the #1 things that religious people are always whining about? Well, yes and no. God said to Moses, "Thou shalt not kill." A simple commandment, the sort of thing you can carve in stone. Nevertheless, Deuteronomy 20:16 says, "In the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and as the Lord your God has commanded you." Well, that sounds an awful lot like killing to me. A ding. I mean, it's only the book of Deuteronomy and we're already wiping out entire cities.
Kill everyone now!
So maybe the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," only means don't kill Israelites. In fact, that is what it means. The Canaanites don't have a covenant with God, so fuck them.
Condone first-degree murder!
But killing Israelites is not entirely off the table either. For example, according to Leviticus 20:13, say it with me. "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be unalived." Okay, so no killing except the Canaanites and the gays. The exceptions are stacking. So the commandment isn't really "thou shalt not kill," it's "thou shalt not kill unless." Every taboo has exceptions, paradoxically permitted transgressions. And those permitted transgressions simply are the sacred. Thou shalt not kill unless. The unless is the permitted transgression, is the sacred. The commandment, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," could be rephrased as "Thou shalt not have sex unless it's with the person who you're married to for the purpose of procreation or whatever it is you people do. For most women, identifying with power means identifying with men. For most of history, merging with a man has been many women's only plausible path to power. Traditional marriage strongly incentivizes women to identify with their husbands and enjoy his power vicariously. As a 1966 Supreme Court opinion put it, "Though the husband and wife are one, the one is the husband." Most married women still take their husband's surname, symbolically subsuming her identity into his. On the altar,
Queerness, which as established covers far more than just LGBT, was historically considered far too inappropriate on its own. Sexual deviancy, that in itself implies sexuality, doesn't it? It has to be censored, or affiliated negatively. Artists were allowed to use queerness if it portrayed the character who was queer negatively, because that would reinforce the idea that sexual deviancy is negative. As I showed you earlier, the 90s was full of the idea that prison was a hotbed of gay rape because gay sex was being noticed. The idea of the homosexual predator was so prevalent in so many different depictions.
You to hang up that computer call, come over here and kiss me on my hot mouth. I'm feeling romantical.
The sexual deviant archetype has long since been a way to shame and condemn a person or people. Would you like to guess, then, what the most recent law which amended the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910 is called? The Child Sexual Abuse and Pornography Act of 1986. Because it's so easy to get a law passed when you're making it about minor attracted people and child sexual abuse prevention. Because who's going to argue against that? Morally, you would be vilified for even speaking out against it. But when you break it down, what is it actually doing? Not what it claims to be doing, but how the law actually impacts people and society. Due to recent news, you might have heard of the Comstock Act of 1873, which did not prohibit obscenity, but it did restrict the U.S. Postal Service and any common carrier from conveying obscene material. Let me make this clear, because in modern day, phone companies and internet service providers are considered common carriers. If you've heard of the Comstock Act of 1873, it's probably because of the recent Supreme Court abortion ruling. The law has been talked about in media recently because it's very possible it can be used to prohibit contraceptives from being shipped in the mail, among many other things. Again, it prohibits any common carrier from conveying what the law considers to be obscene. And internet service providers are considered common carriers. This is a law still in effect from the 1800s. It's simply adapted to fit the moral views of the shifting time period. Once racial inequality was no longer tolerable outright in the law, it was amended. Once sexual inequality was no longer tolerable outright in the law, it was amended. The laws altogether should be done away with. We can't just change it, shift it to fit what we now realize. Oh, all of a sudden, it's the law which is promoting such inequality in the first place. The Comstock Act did not criminalize obscenity, but the Supreme Court has continued to rule that obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. This means that hate speech has more protection than obscenity. And I'm not saying that it should be the other way around. I'm just pointing out it shows where our priorities lie when only one of them is made criminal. In 1915, the Supreme Court would rule unanimously that films can be legally banned. It took them nearly 40 years later, in 1952, when the Supreme Court ruled that no, films cannot be outright prohibited by the government. However, they were targeting a very specific part of the law. They ruled that sacrilegious films cannot be prohibited by virtue of simply being sacrilegious. They left in other parts of the law, which included a provision which banned obscene films. 5 years later, in 1957, the Supreme Court would officially, for the first time, codify into United States judicial law that no, obscenity is officially not protected by the First Amendment. To put this into perspective, it was not until a year later, 1958, when the Supreme Court ruled that pro-homosexual material is not explicitly obscene on its own. This means that until this ruling, any jurisdiction which made criminal pro-homosexual content could in fact get away with it by simply ruling that it is obscene. This is why laws and policies which leave such vague moral interpretations for application are so dangerous. Sure, nowadays we have legal protections for sexuality, but does that cover age attractions? I think you know the answer.
Isaac detailed an experience that had significant negative consequences for his future. He had been enrolled in a master's degree program for mental health counseling, he explained.
I came out to a small group of students, maybe 10 or 12 students in each group. And we had an instructor and he told us to share something that we were really dealing with. And I said, if I share mine, everyone will reject me. One of the female students said, "I'm upset at that. We would not reject you." So I went ahead and told them, and they took it well at first. Then they promptly distanced themselves from me, ignored me, and the teacher, the instructor, broke confidentiality we were assured of, and told the administration, and they told me I had to leave the residency. So they sent me home. That's where I was probably most devastated. I was very stressed and anxious. I would shake without any cause for it.
Isaac took legal action against the school because their handbook stipulated that they did not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. In the process, he was outed to the judge, attorneys, and others involved in the case. Despite his efforts, he lost the case.
This is why legal protections don't really matter when the system itself is fundamentally unequal. Jacobez versus Ohio, 1960s, the Supreme Court ruled that movie theaters were protected for playing movies if the movie they were playing was not obscene. A little bit afterwards, Memoirs versus Massachusetts, the Supreme Court ruled that literature which expressed ideas that were not tied to illegal acts were protected. Again, if it's not tied to an illegal act, and if it's illegal or not was decided by whether or not it was obscene. For every legal victory, there seemed to be a dozen losses. And remember, every victory could still be overturned at any point, as Roe v. Wade proved recently. Would you like to know how this all gets worse? In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled FCC versus Pacifica Foundation, a case that involved George Carlin's famous 7 words you can't say on television.
Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits!
In ruling in the FCC's favor, they specified that not only does the FCC have the authority to censor obscenity, but that
broadcasting has the most limited First Amendment protection. Among the reasons for especially treating indecent broadcasting is the uniquely pervasive presence that medium of expression occupies in the lives of our people. Broadcasts extend into the privacy of the home, and it is impossible completely to avoid those that are patently offensive. Broadcasting, moreover, is uniquely accessible to children.
Again, children were used as the moral justification for a law still in place today. Let me make this clear. The Supreme Court did not just say, oh, obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. They did that already, looked at the FCC case, and said, this is not obscenity, this is indecency, but even though it's not obscenity, we still rule it can be made illegal because the radio station is something children can access easily. The First Amendment does not apply here because if it did, it would be protecting too much. We can't have the First Amendment protecting too much now, can we? That is what the Supreme Court ruled in this case, and it's still law of the land. Luckily, indecency is still permitted on the internet, as Reno versus ACLU decided in 1997. However, it's worrying to think about just how different the court might have ruled if the decision came a few years later, when the internet became as pervasive as radios were. Even more so today. Regardless, the fact that obscenity is not allowed anywhere, including the internet, can still be felt. In fact, the Department of Justice, back in 2005, established the Obscenity Prosecution Task Force. There was a website known as Red Rose Stories, entirely dedicated to text-based fantasies. And you can agree, morally, all you want on whether or not the content of a story is disturbing, makes you uncomfortable. But the fact is, the Department of Justice was legally allowed to arrest, shut down, and make the founder plead guilty for a website based around text. And once again, we get into the territory of what makes you uncomfortable. You might be distressed, even disturbed by talking about such subjects, but that's exactly what has allowed it to be perpetuated for so long. Porn was allowed to be illegal for so long because so many people were afraid to talk about it. It was considered abhorrent to even think about. And that's exactly what people think about minor attracted people today. Why so many laws are permissed, because they revolve around the idea of these people. New York versus Ferber was a 1982 Supreme Court case which ruled that sexually explicit content of minors could be prohibited, even if they were not obscene. Once again, Just like with the radio, when children were involved, the exception gained another exception. It didn't matter if it wasn't obscene, even if obscenity was already the exception carved out by the court. This actually overturned a lower court ruling, which had much better hindsight, realizing what problems might arise that you yourself might have as well.
The statute would prohibit the showing of any play or movie in which a child portrays a defined sexual act, real or simulated, in a non-obscene manner. It would also prohibit the sale, showing, or distribution of medical or educational materials containing photographs of such acts. Indeed, by its terms, the statute would prohibit those who oppose such portrayals from providing illustrations of what they oppose.
Now, isn't that ironic? Despite the keen insight provided by the lower court, the Supreme Court ruled the opposite, deciding that the moral good outweighed any possible dangers which might come. Look, we can get into the psychology of whether or not access to porn reduces sex offenses all we want. The point is, people were allowed to be arrested. For fuck's sake, Australia was able to make hentai illegal because some people might have intended their drawing to be a certain age. It's a drawing. But this issue points to another phenomenon I've been hinting at. Hentai is exclusive to Japan. You might have noticed then, throughout this whole video, most of the discourse around minor attracted people have been in the West. Countries like Japan have such openness with their sexuality, even age attraction is a category for their erotica. I said early on in this video that we would have to understand where our understanding comes from. I then went on to explain how it is the ruling class subjugates those under it with their morality. But now we reach another point, that which the cultural variation in morality points out. Because where does the ruling class's understanding come from? How is it that there could have been minorities in the ruling class when it's those features which are used to subjugate people? Why would they be okay with those features being used to demonize others when they have it themselves? Everything I've spoken about has been internal to the Western cultural discourse to which these issues are relegated towards. I mean, think about it. If other cultures have different concepts of gender, then how could they have the same concept of sexuality? Before this video ends, I need to make sure this point has been clear to you thus far. Every identity which we take upon ourselves are socially generated conceptions artificially crafted by the ruling class to internally divide us as a people. What Henrietta Moore was talking about was the interpersonal relationship we have with people directly, which shapes our identity through the trauma we experience through interactions based upon how people are socially expecting us to act. But we need to now look at the greater social reality, because it's not simply based around our internal, localized cultural references. How do people fare in this social continuum in other cultures, which have different socially generated expectations based on different material conditions they find themselves in? The identities which have been crafted by the ruling class have constantly been used to demonize. Think about the identity of minor attracted people, which has been unified in a singular identity of predator, attracted to little girls, little boys. The identities which have in the past been used for gay people that were later co-opted by them, but originally used as a ploy to demonize them. Think about the cultural references which were used to demonize African Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, later co-opted by them and reclaimed proudly to be part of their cultural identity. The ruling class occupies identities and subject positions which we associate with those marginalized, and that is used by the ruling class to promote certain people within them as speakers, representatives of those people. But it was those identities crafted by the ruling class in the first place. This points to an issue which might have been gnawing in the back of your mind this whole time, and that is, if there are gay people in the ruling class, why was being gay such a looked down upon facet for so long? If there are pedophiles in the ruling class, which I'm sure you already accepted in the beginning of this video, why are they looked down upon? Enough about the subjective, let's talk reality. I made a brief comment earlier about how there are some subject positions in which people reside that are not able to be shifted, such as racial minorities. But I wish to clarify now an important point. The subject positions are shiftable, it's that people are not able to consciously shift them. In the case of racial minorities, there is vitiligo, famously in the case of Michael Jackson. and sexuality is no different. This really shouldn't be all that surprising, considering how the brain is able to shift so many other aspects in so many different ways that we are able to accept easily. Youth may experience a change in one or more aspects of their sexual orientation over time. These changes in sexual orientation also have been referred to as fluidity or mobility. Similarly, Diamond, in a review of evidence of sexual orientation change, reported longitudinal changes in sexual attraction and discordance among sexual attraction, behavior, and identity among adults. Feinstein et al. Found that 34.4% of participants reported at least one change in sexual orientation during the study period, with 24.6% reporting one change and 9.8% reporting two or more changes. This was not one study, but a systematic review of 30 different studies. And if you're wondering how it is exactly I know this applies to age attraction as well as sex attraction, I can tell you I was just as surprised as you probably are when I was told directly by a minor attracted person how their age attraction range shifted as they got older. They were also a researcher. And before moving on, because it is important to state, conversion therapy is a business scam. Although these reviews have provided summative evidence of sexual identity change in adults, how this phenomenon manifests in adolescence and young adulthood, and the relationship between orientation change and health outcomes remain largely unexplored. There is no current understanding for the actual neurological processes behind sexual fluidity, so any therapy claiming such knowledge is nothing more than a business scam. Most studies included in the review used Kinsey-informed Likert scale that measured sexual orientation or attraction on a continuum ranging from 100% opposite sex to 100% same-sex attraction, which assumes that sexual orientation is a two-dimensional experience. Further work must be responsive of current evidence and include language that is inclusive of diversity and breaks away from dichotomous understanding of orientation experiences. Additionally, studies reporting on sexual identity labels and changes can capture contemporary vocabulary and associated meanings. For example, sexual identity labels like pansexual, demisexual, and queer are based on an expanded understanding of self, both in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity, and at times fall outside of the binary. It is important to note that some studies included in the review found no significant differences in sexual orientation change by gender, especially among sexual minority participants. So now, having finally hammered that point in for the final time, where do these distortions of reality originate, prior to even the ruling class's awareness of the Foster and Adopt a Have? Well, who better to explain the inner workings of class struggle than Karl Marx?
Proletariat and wealth are opposites. As such, they form a single whole. They are both creations of the world of private property. The question is exactly what place each occupies in the antithesis. It is not sufficient to declare them two sides of a single whole. Private property as well, is compelled to maintain itself, and thereby its opposite, the proletariat in existence. This is the positive side of antithesis private property. The proletariat, on the contrary, is compelled as proletariat to abolish itself and thereby its opposite, private property, which determines its existence and which makes it proletariat. It is the negative side of the antithesis, its restlessness within its very self, dissolved and self-dissolving private property. The property class and the class of the proletariat present the same human self-estrangement, but the former class feels at ease and strengthened in this self-estrangement. It recognizes estrangement as its own power and has in it the semblance of a human existence. The class of the proletariat feels annihilated in estrangement. It sees in its own powerlessness and the reality of an inhuman existence. Within this antithesis, the private property owner is therefore the conservative side, the proletarian the destructive side. From the former arises the action of preserving the antithesis, from the latter the action of annihilating it.
The very existence of the ruling class is a contradiction. A small group of people controlling all the resources in a nation? People would never allow that unless they were focused elsewhere. The material conditions in which a person finds themselves in dictates what metaphysical concepts develop their understanding. The ruling class does not come up with bullshit to peddle, because an outright falsification would be hard to believe for anyone under them as well.
It was not that the founders of property overlooked this course of its development in their concern for their needs. It was rather that they did not foresee it, but even if they had been able to foresee it, their actual need would have gained the upper hand. He thus falls into petitio principii. He makes the state sell lands, he lets industrialists buy those estates. That is to say, he proposes the property relations that he wishes to prove.
The beliefs that the ruling class express are genuine because they must justify their own existence to themselves. All of their metaphysical concepts are based upon the social position they find themselves in, being at the top of the hierarchy, and their environment, having a very sheltered life, being protected from the material conditions that most people would say is normal.
This is where Angel Studios comes in. After Disney let the distribution rights expire for Sound of Freedom, they sold it to Angel Studios, a faith-based company founded by the Harmon brothers. The brothers Harmon are quite literally marketing geniuses. Their skills and talents could not be more perfectly suited to the needs of the companies they've done work for, including their own. What Angel Studios has done is what every corporation dreams of. These motherfuckers have harnessed virality. The thing about virality is that almost by definition, it cannot happen the same way twice. The thing to internalize here is that viruses don't succeed by coming up with some master strategy of domination that accounts for every contingency at the outset. They do it by responding to the constant informational feedback loop created by the open-air experiment that is the infection itself. What the Harmon brothers understand about virality that has eluded other companies is that to go viral does not mean controlling cultural fashion, it means being in tune with and responsive to cultural fashion. This makes its religious identity something of a marketing asset. Angel Studios is an activist studio. It has a moral agenda. And that's not like a bad thing. My main criticism of Hollywood as it's structured right now is that it's effectively a corporatocracy, which is not a good way to structure an art industry if the goal is like good art. Artists are very morally driven people. It's okay to have moral ambitions when you're making movies. They practice that very particular kind of American Christianity where company growth is equated with moral rectitude. Not quite a prosperity gospel, but certainly working within the idea that facilitating business deals is a perfectly expected and normal way for God to indicate his approval. And it's this attitude that I'd like to bring your attention to in the interviews about this movie, because it's central to the way Sound of Freedom works as a political project.
Everybody's saying you cannot launch a movie in July. That's when all the $100 million films are coming out. That's when Indiana Jones comes out, and when Mission Impossible and Oppenheimer can't happen. And so we made a decision, and the following morning, I was woken at 4 a.m. The words came into my mind, Neil, September 15th is too late. July 4th. If you'll step forward, the doors will be opened.
I'm not saying he's faking it. Quite the opposite. I think part of the reason the Harmon brothers are so good at marketing is because they come at it with great sincerity.
Those beliefs then go on to subjugate the classes underneath the ruling class, being newly interpreted in however the lower classes diversify it.
The old method of investigation and thought, metaphysical, which preferred to investigate things as given, as fixed and stable, a method of relics of which still strongly haunt people's minds, had a great deal of historical justification in its day. It was necessary first to examine things before it was possible to examine processes. One had first to know what a particular thing was before one could observe the changes it was undergoing. And such was the case with natural science. The old metaphysics, which accepted things as finished objects, arose from a natural science, which investigated dead and living things as finished objects. But when this investigation had progressed so far that it became possible to take the decisive step forward, that is, to pass on the systematic investigation of the changes which these things undergo in nature itself, While natural science up to the end of the last century was predominantly a collecting science, a science of finished things, in our century it is essentially a systemizing science, a science of the processes, of the origin and development of these things, and of the interconnection which binds all these natural processes into one great whole. Physiology, which investigates the processes occurring in plant and animal organisms. Embryology, which deals with the development of individual organisms from germs to maturity. Geology, which investigates the gradual formation of Earth's surface.
There has never been a fixed state of things. Whether we like it or not, we're a part of the natural world, and the ebb and flow that comes with it, the dialectical flux of the material world. No one is ever just, who are you? Because at any point, they could be someone else.
What is true of nature, which is hereby recognized also as a historical process of development, is likewise true of the history of society in all its branches and of the totality of all sciences, which occupy themselves with things human. In one point, however, the history of the development of society proves to be essentially different from that of nature. In nature, there are only blind, unconscious agencies acting upon one another, out of whose interplay the general law comes into operation. Nothing of all that happens as a consciously desired aim. In the history of society, on the contrary, the actors are all endowed with consciousness, are men acting with deliberation or passion, working towards definite goals. Nothing happens without a conscious purpose, without an intended aim. But this distinction cannot alter the fact that the course of history is governed by inner general laws. For here also, on the whole, in spite of consciously desired aims of all individuals, accident apparently reigns on the surface. That which is willed happens but rarely. In the majority of instances, the numerous desired ends cross and conflict with one another. Or these ends themselves are from the outset incapable of realization, or the means of attaining them are insufficient. Thus the conflicts of innumerable individual wills and individual actions in the domain of history produce a state of affairs entirely analogous to that prevailing in the realm of unconscious nature. The ends of the actions are intended, but the results which actually follow from these actions are not intended. Or when they do seem to correspond to the end intended, they ultimately have consequences quite other than those intended. Historical events thus appear on the whole to be likewise governed by chance. But where on the surface accident holds sway, there actually it is always governed by inner, hidden laws, and it is only a matter of discovering these laws. Men make their own history, whatever its outcome may be, in that each person follows his own consciously desired end. And it is precisely the resultant of these many wills operating in different directions and of their manifold effects upon the outer world that constitutes history. Thus, it is also a question of what the many individuals desire. The will is determined by passion or deliberation, but the levers which immediately determine passion or deliberation are very different kinds. Partly they may be external objects, partly ideal motives, ambition, enthusiasm for truth and justice, personal hatred, or even purely individual whims of all kinds. But on the one hand, we have seen that the many individual wills active in history, for the most part, produce results quite other than those intended. Often, quite the opposite, that their motives therefore, in relation to the total result, are likewise of only secondary importance. On the other hand, the further question arises: what driving forces in turn stand behind these motives? What are the historical forces which transform themselves into these motives in the brains of the actors?
Minor attracted people did not start off as one of the most discriminated against people because they did not start off as an identity of people. No identity today started off the way it is currently.
They have transformed Sound of Freedom from an entertainment industry misfire into a spiritual event. This is the holy grail of all advertisement. You don't convince people to buy your product because of the features it offers. You convince people by implying that buying this thing will fundamentally change their life. That's pretty hard for companies selling baked beans or laundry detergent, but becomes a lot easier if the thing you're selling is the literal concept of salvation itself. Both Angel Studios and The Daily Wire are openly driven by conservative moral values, and both rely mainly on streaming as their distribution model, with some dabbling in theatrical releases. In terms of raw marketing power, The Daily Wire actually has a significant advantage over Angel Studios, which lacks the social media network and reputation The Daily Wire has built over the past decade. But all these movies came and went with little cultural acknowledgement from anyone, while this movie became one of the most profitable independent movies of all time. What happened here? The difference between the two is a matter of how these companies are approaching conservatism as an ideology. In videos about The Daily Wire's foray into film production, the boys of The Daily Wire like to say this.
We want to make content that you want to see, not content that you think you're supposed to see.
I think of this as their mission statement, the driving ethos by which The Daily Wire makes all its stuff. And I don't think Lil Benny or any of the rest of this merry band of doofuses would disagree. The problem is that The Daily Wire's marketing strategy is intellectual. Now, hear me out. The Daily Wire premises their media on the existence of a silent majority. The idea that people on the right are actually the reasonable, rational ones, and that woke blue-haired gender ideologues are conquering the media landscape that should rightfully be dominated by the measured, restrained, conservative majority that they imagine constitutes most of American society. That present conservatism as unassailable, a source of all human truth so ironclad that it doesn't even need defending. This is fine, as long as you don't make anything but vacant claims to facts and logic and gish-gallop over any opposition. Unfortunately, actually making things requires some integrity and vulnerability and consistency of belief. So this is the corner The Daily Wire has painted itself into. They have claimed that their productions are destined for success because they appeal to a moral majority. But sometime in the past few years, they got a little too high on their own supply and forgot that claiming everybody thinks like you is really only useful as a rhetorical device. Because no matter what your ideology is, if you're the spokesperson for it, you represent a pretty concentrated example of devotion. So it's actually pretty unlikely that most people think just like you. Trying to prove this out means you will almost certainly embarrass yourself. Like, you can tell everyone you have a super hot girlfriend who lives in Canada, and that might get you somewhere, but you can't invite your imaginary Canadian girlfriend to prom, and if you try, you're gonna look like a huge dumbass. Companies like Angel Studios that operate on explicitly faith-based motivations are governed by a much more consistent and therefore effective ontology than The Daily Wire. The world is sinful, and it's the Christian task to save others, which means that conservative media, far from being the superior and dominant force, is always operating with a handicap. This allows them to spin all failures as the work of the devil and all successes into triumphs of the Christian destiny against all odds. Fascism does the exact same thing, which I think is a large part of the reason so many Christians seem so susceptible to fascism. To quote Umberto Eco's essay, Ur Fascism, thus, by a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. Fascist governments are condemned to lose wars because they are constitutionally incapable of objectively evaluating the force of the enemy. To restate, the reason Christians are always at war with the other is the same reason fascists are, because the enemy always fights dirty. Of course, Satan and his sinners are going to have the upper hand against the godly, just the same as the common folk have no hope against the global financial network of Jewry.
History has constantly been a class struggle because the ruling capitalist class has constantly fought tooth and nail to make sure anyone who fought their whole lives just accepts a tiny concession out of fear of gaining nothing at all. We have so little to claim as our own because in modern day, no worker is ever truly the owner of their product, no person truly independent of society and of others. We are all interconnected, whether we like it or not, in modern society, in modern industrial capitalist culture. I understand the limitations of my own video and that this approach falls victim to the idea that changing minds can occur before changing material conditions, which, as I've hopefully made clear, is a backwards approach. My intentions in making this were to help me go on to the next level, establishing a social support group for minor affected people. One that is uniquely not based around crime prevention, if you didn't realize when I gave examples of different support groups. Before you act, virtuous pedophiles, the name clearly implies that they are exemplifying themselves by how they differ from the rest, by how they are not offending. This is the project I've been meeting with researchers about, to establish a social support group which would be based around the social. a support group where minor attracted people could be open with one another about their attractions, but that it would not be based specifically about that. It would simply be an outlet for them to do so. This video simply was to help in that endeavor. Anyone who watched this and might have related a bit more than they thought possible, well, feel free to reach out. And for those who had recognized their thoughts and simply watched this video to learn how to accept them, please feel free as well.